She was washing blood from her hands in a Mafia boss's kitchen. At 11:47 p.m., Sarafina stood alone in Kyle Duval's penthouse, scrubbing her fingers until her skin turned red, praying no one noticed she had been crying. But Kyle noticed everything: the bruises, the shaking, the fear every time a door closed behind her. And when he asked, "Who did this to you?" she realized the most dangerous man in Manhattan might be the only one powerful enough to protect her. Case File 42. Tonight, you and I are going to examine a fascinating intersection of trauma and apex predation. The subject is a 26-year-old female displaying acute stress responses. It is 11:47 p.m. She stands in the private kitchen of Manhattan's most lethal, megalomaniacal narcissist, compulsively scrubbing her hands. She does not realize the architect of her psychological ruin has breached her perimeter. Meanwhile, the man entering the room, a textbook sociopath with immaculate impulse control, is about to become her sole barrier against annihilation. Let us clinically dissect how a traumatized subordinate and a crime lord turned a penthouse into a behavioral war room. Fear dictates behavior only until survival demands a new baseline. Let us begin. Before we proceed, tell me your city of origin in the comments. I am curious to track the spread of this behavioral profile. Observe the subject, Sarafina. The environment smells of citrus solvents, but the underlying scent is biological terror. Notice her physical compulsions. She attacks a stain that vanished 20 minutes prior. This is classic avoidance behavior. Ceasing motor function invites intrusive memories, and memories trigger the panic cascade. The penthouse is silent, save for running water and her tightly regulated respiration. She has been conditioned through prolonged psychological torment to suppress auditory cues. In her fractured mind, survival strictly requires total invisibility. It is exactly 11:47 p.m., and her nervous system is trapped in a permanent state of fight or flight. The support staff of Kyle Duval vacated the premises 2 hours prior. Sarafina remains purely as a maladaptive coping mechanism. Prolonged shifts delay exposure to mass transit, thereby minimizing the probability of her former abuser tracking her. She actively represses his name, a textbook compartmentalization tactic. Her preferred operational zone is this 42nd floor kitchen. The structural design is deeply indicative of Duval's pathology. Floor-to-ceiling glass creates the illusion of dominion over the metropolis. The aesthetic relies entirely on freezing Italian marble. Every angle here is pristine, sterile, and entirely devoid of emotional warmth. It is the architectural manifestation of a megalomaniacal narcissist who constructed a criminal empire upon a foundation of absolute, terrifying control. For 6 months, the subject has inhabited this ecosystem. Her exposure to Duval is limited to late-night intervals when he returns from illicit operations. The diagnostic data on Duval is extensive. He utilizes elite establishments as fronts for financial laundering and political manipulation. At 34, his insulation is so absolute that merely uttering his name invites lethal retaliation. Yet, the clinical data shows 0 instances of him directing aggression towards Sarafina. This absence of violence is precisely the variable that drew her into his orbit. She sought an apex predator's territory to camouflage herself from a lesser threat. The fundamental lesson is that trauma victims will often run into the jaws of a wolf if it guarantees the hunting dogs will finally lose their scent entirely. You and I must recognize the flawed logic of a fractured mind here. She hypothesized that predators respect territorial boundaries, believing proximity to Duval equated to invisibility. Under the scalding water, She experiences a fleeting moment of dissociation, fantasizing about an end to her flight. Then, the auditory trigger occurs, a minor decibel shift, the soft latch of a closing door. Immediately, her sympathetic nervous system overrides rational thought. Motor functions paralyze, respiration suspends. We observe severe muscular constriction. In her clinical history, the isolated sound of a door sealing her inside a room has consistently served as the precursor to severe emotional devastation. Her body anticipates the arrival of pain before her conscious mind can even process the current reality. She maintains a rigid stance. Her prefrontal cortex engages in rapid threat assessment, calculating spatial geometry and viability of egress. Fleeing typically escalates predatory pursuit. Then, an auditory stimulus breaches the silence. The tone is measured, entirely lacking emotional volatility. Who did this to you? Her cardiac rhythm decelerates. The vocal signature belongs to Duval. He is the stabilizing variable in her chaotic environment. Notice her compliance protocols activating. She initiates a slow rotation. Her hands remain visibly elevated above the marble. This is an advanced survival mechanism. She understands that abrupt kinetic shifts mimic aggression, which invites retaliation. She is managing his potential volatility, unaware that a true megalomaniac does not react. Duval occupies the space with the deliberate stillness of an apex predator. His tailored suit is not merely aesthetic, it is a calculated weaponization of authority. His ocular baseline is chilling a distinct lack of blinking that indicates extreme hyperfocus. He holds a glass but refrains from consumption, maintaining total cognitive supremacy. He is simply processing her micro-expressions. Serafina instinctively adopts a submissive posture, diverting her gaze downward. I am sorry, Mr. Duval. I did not realize you were home. I can finish this tomorrow. Duval issues a singular directive. Answer the questions. There is no elevation in volume. It is the absolute, unyielding command of a narcissist whose pathology dictates that the universe must instantly bend to his will. For years, the subject has deployed verbal deflection to de-escalate hostile encounters. Yet, subjected to Duval's clinical scrutiny, her deceptive algorithms fail. The gravitational weight of his narcissistic certainty renders falsehood impossible. Well, nearly impossible. I do not know what you mean. She attempts to deflect. Duval places his glass on the marble. The acoustic impact is minimal, yet it triggers a severe involuntary muscular spasm in her. This visible manifestation of terror deeply shames her. She despises that her trauma is no longer internalized, but broadcasted neurologically. Duval catalogs this reaction instantly. Nothing escapes his behavioral sweep. He initiates a methodical advance across the perimeter. He intentionally regulates his velocity to prevent panic. Pay close attention here, because this is where the psychological manipulation becomes masterful. Upon reaching the boundary, Duval defies predatory expectations. Instead of utilizing physical intimidation, he manipulates spatial dynamics. He positions a chair and descends to her precise optical elevation. By neutralizing the vertical power imbalance, he short-circuits her conditioned threat responses. Serafina experiences profound cognitive dissonance. Duval's affect remains completely flat. His ocular lock implies he is dissecting her neurobiology. He recites empirical data, the bruise on your wrist, the way you flinch when doors close, the fact that you are scrubbing a clean counter at midnight because you are afraid to go home. He dismantles her denial with cold precision. She immediately conceals her trembling hands, a futile attempt to mask physiological distress. I am fine, she lies. Duval rejects it instantly. You are not. Who did this to you? The repetition functions as a cognitive wrecking ball. The elaborate defensive architecture she spent months constructing begins to catastrophically fail. She realizes his interrogation is devoid of empathy. It is an exercise in dominance. He already possesses the factual intelligence regarding her abuser. He simply requires her to articulate her victimhood aloud. It is complicated, she deflects. It is not, he counters. You do not understand, she whispers. Then explain it to me. As her vision blurs, she engages in extreme emotional suppression, terrified of terminal vulnerability. Observe Duval's implementation of tactical silence. He does not avert his gaze or offer useless platitudes. He simply occupies the vacuum, forcing her internal pressure to reach a critical threshold. For the subject, this absolute stillness is more destabilizing than physical violence. She understands traditional cruelty, but this relentless observation offers no predictable metric for survival. Her defenses collapse. I had a boyfriend, she finally confesses. His name was Adrian Mercer. We were together for 2 years. Notice the sudden microshift in Duval's baseline, a coldness descending. It is a predator identifying a rival within its domain.
Past tense,
He clinically notes. She nods, staring at the floor tiles. I left 6 months ago. The admission seals her fate. Let us examine the profile of the antagonist together. And he is still looking for you, Duval states. It is not a question. The subject confirms Mercer is a highly integrated sociopath, camouflaged as a philanthropic capitalist who preaches ethical leadership. Behind closed doors, he employed severe coercive control. He never hit me, she rationalizes. Not once. So it was not abuse. He just cared too much. She clings to the absence of physical violence as proof she was not victimized. This is the very nucleus of Stockholm Syndrome. The victim romanticizes their captivity to survive it. Duval displays a rare autonomic response, a microscopic tightening of his jaw. How long did it take you to believe that? He asks. Her resulting vocalization is a deeply fractured laugh. The environment returns to a sterile equilibrium. The low hum of appliances underscores the gravity of the psychological transfer. Duval processes the data. He rises with frictionless precision, terminating the spatial equity. He consumes his beverage in a single motion, resetting his baseline. You are safe here, he dictates. It is not comfort. It is a declaration of territorial supremacy. Sarafina's trauma severely inhibits her capacity to process this assertion. She projects Mercer's omnipotence onto the situation. You do not know him, she whispers. Adrian is careful. He does not make mistakes, and he does not stop. Duval's response is the ultimate manifestation of megalomaniacal grandiosity. Neither do I. Sometimes escaping a monster requires a darker predator. In my years interviewing cartel bosses and serial predators in maximum security, I have seen this exact dynamic play out. The words land with absolute, chilling certainty. Kyle steps closer, yet perfectly calibrates his distance to avoid triggering her flight response. He looks at her with unblinking, pale eyes. You work for me now, he states. That means you are under my protection. And no one hurts what belongs to my household. A textbook display of megalomaniac narcissism. He doesn't view her as human, but as an acquired asset. Yet Sarafina does not rebel. She feels a fragile, desperate hope. This is the seed of Stockholm Syndrome, taking root in real time. She asks what happens if her abuser finds her. Kyle's face shifts into something beautifully lethal. Sometimes, the only thing that can protect you from a monster is a more powerful monster. He simply replies that the man will wish he had never tried. 3 days pass in clinical silence. Sarafina goes through the motions of her routine, cleaning immaculate rooms. The household staff maintain a sterile, professional distance, pretending that kitchen conversation never occurred, but the territorial markers of a predator are shifting around her. Small, calculated changes. Security codes mutate overnight. The doorman examines identification with forensic intensity. Cameras are quietly angled to cover new blind spots. No one explains this to Sarafina, but a hyper-vigilant mind always notices the tightening of a perimeter. The lesson here is simple. True power rarely announces itself. It simply rearranges the environment. On the fourth evening, while organizing the West Wing, the murmur of voices drifts from Kyle's private study. The heavy oak door is left open just a fraction. You and I need to pay close attention to this moment. She recognizes Kyle's voice instantly, low and saturated with control. The second voice belongs to a nervous subordinate. The man reports on Adrian Mercer. Age 37, an Ivy League degree, a net worth of $200 million. His background is surgically clean, devoid of even a parking violation. Kyle dismisses the illusion immediately. "Keep looking," he orders. The investigator hesitates, citing 15 years of experience. Kyle's logic is the logic of an apex predator who recognizes his own kind. When the subordinate quietly asks what exactly they are searching for, Kyle's answer is chilling. Everything he buried. A spotless record is often the loudest warning sign. Sarafina stands frozen in the hallway. Her autonomic nervous system urges her to flee, to feign ignorance, but trauma binds her to the spot. The subordinate warns that such a deep dive could take weeks. "You have 72 hours, Kyle states, his tone slicing through the air. Dismissed. As footsteps approach the door, Sarafina's survival instincts finally override her paralysis. She grabs a stack of towels and bolts, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Kyle is actively hunting Adrian. Her psychological state fractures between profound relief and absolute terror. That evening, she discovers an unmarked book left on the kitchen counter. The title reads, "Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life." Knowledge is a weapon, but only if you have the courage to pick it up. She studies the cover for a long minute before retreating to the clinical safety of her quarters. She reads until 4 in the morning. Every single page reads like a psychiatric evaluation of her own trauma. The systematic isolation, the obsessive monitoring, the gaslighting that made her question her own reality. Adrian had packaged his pathology as love. When sleep finally claims her, it brings night terrors of endless, suffocating corridors and a whispering voice promising eternal captivity. We cannot outrun our own minds. 2 weeks later, the physical world breaches her sanctuary. Her phone vibrates during a quiet lunch hour. An unknown number flashes on the screen. She sits completely paralyzed. A message materializes. "I know where you are." The fragile illusion of safety simply evaporates. Her cognitive functioning immediately shuts down. Peripheral vision darkens into a tunnel. Her hands lose all sensation, and the device clatters against the kitchen tile. 6 months of meticulous invisibility. 6 months of constructing a synthetic sense of security, completely obliterated in a single second. The human brain, when subjected to chronic threat, maps escape routes on autopilot. She could pack a bag, assume a new alias, and vanish into another sprawling metropolis. But exhaustion is a heavy anchor. She is clinically fatigued from the running, tired of letting this malignant narcissist dismantle her future. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is what finally gives you the footing to stand. Moving purely on instinct, she retrieves the phone and marches directly toward the security hub. The guard on duty is Marcus, an ex-military man conditioned to recognize panic. He evaluates her pale face instantly. "I need to speak to Mr. Duval," she states. Her vocal cords produce a sound far steadier than her internal chaos dictates. Marcus processes her physical symptoms and bypasses standard protocol, radioing his employer directly. The response is immediate and devoid of hesitation. "Send her up." Kyle's private command center occupies the entire northeast corner of the penthouse. The architecture itself is designed for psychological dominance. Floor-to-ceiling glass, stark minimalist aesthetics, and a massive black walnut desk. Your environment always reflects the architecture of your mind, and this room is built for absolute, uncompromising control. She steps into the room to find Kyle facing the glass, a phone pressed to his ear. He is dispensing orders with the surgical precision of an autocrat. "I do not care what the board says," he demands. "Make it happen tonight." He terminates the call and turns. The micro-expressions on his face shift instantly upon registering her physiological distress. "What happened?" he demands. It is not an inquiry, but an extraction of data. Serafina crosses the floor on trembling legs and surrenders her phone. Kyle absorbs the threat, and his entire physical form goes completely rigid. Let me tell you from experience, the silence of a dangerous man is terrifying. It is not an absence of noise, but a violent accumulation of pressure, like the heavy, suffocating air right before a hurricane makes landfall. When he finally breaks the silence, his tone is unnervingly gentle, a calculated, soothing technique. He extracts the timeline. 5 minutes ago, he confirms she has not responded. He places the device on his desk with deliberate exactness and issues a single command. "Sit." Kyle retrieves water, then bypasses the power dynamic of his desk, pulling a chair to face her on equal ground. "You did the right thing," he murmurs. Her throat constricts. "I should have," she begins, but he cuts off the self-blame. "You did the right thing coming here," he reinforces. The psychological validation strikes her nervous sense like a physical shockwave. True healing begins the exact moment someone finally believes you. She presses her hands against her face, fighting a desperate biological urge to weep. She apologizes for acting as a liability. Kyle locks onto her gaze with unnerving intensity. "You are not a liability," he states. "You are a member of my household, and I protect what is mine." This overt declaration of ownership should trigger her flight response. It mirrors the proprietary language her abuser utilized. Yet, her trauma bond is shifting targets, adapting to a new host. Kyle's brand of possessiveness bypasses her defenses because it presents itself as a shield rather than a cage. "What happens now?" she asks. Kyle stands, smoothly reclaiming his authority. He examines the threat again, then brandishes his own device. Action is the ultimate antidote to fear. "Now," he says calmly, "I make some calls." He looks at her, truly observing her state. Beneath his icy exterior, she registers a faint pulse of humanity. "He threatened you on my property," Kyle says quietly. "That makes this my problem." She reminds him that he has no legal obligation to intervene. "I know," he replies. The gravity of those syllables alters the atmosphere. He could easily terminate her employment, severing the chaotic variable from his perfectly ordered life. That would be the statistically probable move for a man of his profile. But loyalty, when freely chosen, forms an unbreakable contract. He dials a number, his voice dropping into a low, predatory cadence. "I need a full workup," he commands his unseen operative. Financial records, travel history, and communication logs. He wants every single digital footprint the abuser has ever left behind in his life. "I do not care what it costs," he dictates. 48 hours. He severs the connection and issues a strict behavioral protocol. Return to your quarters. Remain inside the perimeter. Ignore all digital communications. Do not engage with unidentified contacts. As she reaches the threshold, the anomaly of his altruism forces her to pause. "Why are you doing this?" she asks. His facial muscles remain static, but a dangerous spark ignites in those pale eyes. A microscopic flash of ancient, unhealed trauma. "Because no one did it for me," he answers softly. "We spend our entire adult lives trying to rescue the helpless child we used to be." Before she can fully process the confession, his psychological armor locks back into place. The phone is already at his ear, orchestrating his next calculated move. Nighttime is when the traumatized brain becomes its own worst enemy. She lies rigid beneath the sheets, her amygdala firing relentlessly as it cycles through a carousel of catastrophic outcomes. Adrian is coming. Adrian will dismantle this new reality piece by piece. By 2:13 in the morning, the insomnia defeats her. She wanders toward the kitchen, navigating the cavernous penthouse by the ambient, synthetic glow of the city skyline. Her bare feet make no sound against the freezing marble. When she reaches the doorway, she freezes. Kyle is already occupying the space, stripped of his tailored suits, dressed merely in gray sweatpants and a dark shirt. The terrifying kingpin looks jarringly ordinary. It is deeply unsettling to see a recognized predator completely at rest. His hair lacks its usual precision. Signs of deep cellular fatigue are etched into his features. He is consuming coffee while studying a laptop with the obsessive focus of a man who has not rested in days. Let us examine this interaction closely. When he notices her, there is no demand for an explanation. The silence stretches, devoid of threat. He closes his machine and indicates the empty stool beside him. She takes a seat. Without a word, he operates the French press, adding cream and exactly 1 sugar. He has been quietly analyzing her habits. He asks if she is unable to sleep, and she confirms it. They sit together in the quiet dark, observing the city below. Sometimes, the most profound psychological anchor we can find is simply the silent presence of another soul awake in the night. Let us examine the pathology of shared trauma. Sarafina asks Kale why he isolates himself in such a massive space. A micro-expression flickers across his face, a slight lowering of his psychological defenses. He explains that he grew up in a confined environment where individuals weaponized proximity. He made a vow to apply any future power to engineer distance. She asks what kind of weapon he means. He describes the kind that inflicts invisible psychological wounds. We observe the trauma bond forming. She recognizes this scarring because she survived a megalomaniac herself. She asks his age upon his escape. 17, he replies. When asked about his destination, he clinically states he went anywhere else. She processes this deeply, understanding the survival instinct at play. She understands the desperate psychological reinvention required to erase a former life. She questions if he ever returns, receiving a flat denial. When asked if he misses his past, his pale eyes reveal the underlying fracture of his psyche. One does not miss a prison, he states calmly. One merely metabolizes the fact of survival. They sit quietly as the city hums below, a fragile cognitive bridge forming between mere survival and actual trust. Then, the clinical reality shatters the peace. Kale reveals his findings regarding Adrian Mercer. The megalomaniac narcissist is not merely a businessman. He has weaponized his corporate infrastructure to conduct systemic surveillance on former partners who attempted to sever ties. A profound physiological dread overtakes her. She asks for a count of his victims. Kale confirms at least 7 subjects. When she questions their safety, he notes the abuser is methodical. The narcissist avoids physical violence. Instead, he orchestrates extreme environmental control, systematically gaslighting his victims until their perception of reality fractures. Sarafina shuts her eyes. Intimately familiar with this psychological sabotage, she asks his next move. Kale's demeanor shifts into an icy, predatory stillness. He plans to terminate the behavior. She warns of the stalker's behavioral escalation. The recent message was a boundary test, a deliberate announcement to gauge retaliation. Kale confirms his intent to strike back. Her nervous system triggers a tremor response, forcing her to brace her hands on the cold stone. She notes the antagonist's extensive resources, citing his legal apparatus designed to erase liabilities. Kale leans into her space. His ocular focus narrows with sociopathic certainty, confirming he possesses the exact same capabilities. That declaration triggers a complex duality of terror and security within her psyche. Her trauma response urges her to reject his intervention, to shield him from the destructive blast radius of her former captor. Yet she remains silent. We must note the clinical shift here. For the first time, an apex predator has positioned himself as a barrier against her abuser. Her cognitive exhaustion outweighs her instinct to isolate. She asks for her required role in this operation. Kale simply instructs her to remain stationary and physically secure. He orders her to relinquish control. Her hyper-independence, a classic trauma response, forces a protest. Kale modulates his vocal tone to bypass her defensive triggers. He observes that her solitary survival has drained her reserves, instructing her to transfer the psychological weight. Her ocular response is immediate tearing, a physical release of sustained cortisol. She admits a lack of behavioral programming for reliance. He commands her to acquire it. As morning light breaches the city, her chronic hypervigilance recedes, replaced by a neural pathway resembling trust. Exactly 7 days later, the baseline destabilizes. While cataloging texts, the operative named Marcus interrupts. His facial muscles tense with grim urgency. He formally summons her. Marcus states Duval requires her presence in the surveillance hub. Her autonomic nervous system reacts with a severe gastric drop. She demands data, but Marcus enforces compliance without explanation. Her cardiac rhythm accelerates as she navigates downward. The monitoring room is saturated with closed-circuit feeds. Kale remains rooted before the primary display, exhibiting the stillness of a predator analyzing prey. He issues a single directive to observe. The digital record rewinds 40 minutes. The baseline appears standard, featuring routine pedestrian flow. Then, an anomaly enters the frame, carrying a bouquet of white peonies. Her respiratory function completely paralyzes. Those specific flowers were the megalomaniac's chosen tool for post-abuse cognitive dissonance. Whenever Adrian dismantled her psyche to reconstruct it around his ego, he used those flowers as a psychological trigger. On the screen, the narcissist navigates the lobby with malignant confidence. His outward presentation projects a socially acceptable mask of charm. He initiates an exchange with the personnel, who politely denies his request. Adrian's artificial smile remains fixed, utterly devoid of genuine emotion. He deposits the trigger object, speaks, and executes a calm exit. The behavioral display takes fewer than 90 seconds. The footage halts. Kale pivots toward her. His facial musculature is ruthlessly disciplined, yet his pale eyes register absolute lethal intent. He clinically inquires if she had prior knowledge of this territorial breach. She answers in the negative. Kale interrogates her regarding secondary contact. She confirms silence, and Kale shifts to tactical command, ordering Marcus to extract external feeds to map the departure vector. He mandates a sweep of traffic grids to determine if the threat is localized. Marcus complies. The victim is paralyzed by trauma recall, fixated on the frozen image of Adrian. His presentation is meticulously constructed to manufacture societal trust, a hallmark of the high-functioning sociopath. A wave of physiological nausea overtakes her. Kale breaks the silence. Clinically diagnosing the behavior, the subject is actively escalating. She forces oxygen into her lungs, demanding a psychological translation. Kale confirms the passive observation phase is over. The narcissist is initiating physical proximity to signal his territorial claim. Kale clinically identifies fear as a tool of compliance, noting the abuser's proficiency in wielding it. Her motor functions respond with a defensive clenching of fists as she demands a counter-strategy. Kale secures a nondescript dossier and presents it, announcing the termination of the cycle. Her hands exhibit a neurogenic tremor as she breaches the file. The contents represent a forensic dissection of a serial abuser, financial architecture, communication logs, and victimology reports from 4 separate targets. The psychological parallel to her own trauma induces violent shaking. She demands the source of this intelligence. Kale calmly cites assets trained to unearth what megalomaniacs attempt to bury. She processes the data, recognizing its capacity to obliterate the narcissist's constructed reality. Kale confirms this social annihilation is the objective. Her focus snaps to him, desperate to map his intent. His expressions vanish, replaced by the chilling void of a professional enforcer. He states his intention to engage in a verbal exchange. At 9:47, Kale exits the facility. His presentation is calculated intimidation, an immaculate dark suit devoid of armaments. It is a masterclass in weaponized composure. Through the closed-circuit feeds, she observes him enter an idling black sedan. The vehicle merges into traffic, moving with the predatory silence of an apex hunter. Marcus remains nearby, posture locked in defensive neutrality. She queries the destination. Marcus advises cognitive avoidance, refusing to supply coordinates. He clinically defines Duval's operational parameters. The man does not engage in partial measures. If neutralization is promised, it is underway. He instructs her to maintain a static position. Her digits compress against the desk. Let us analyze this trauma response together. Every hypervigilant tactic she has honed commands her to initiate flight before the narcissist registers the incoming predator. Yet, the systemic exhaustion of chronic fear anchors her. She quietly questions the statistical probability of failure. Marcus exhibits a suppressed smirk. He cites 8 years of observational data, noting Kale routinely dismantles elements far more malignant than a corporate stalker. He guarantees a zero margin of error. The operative's certainty fails to regulate her nervous system. Sarafina holds intimate data regarding the narcissist's reaction to boundary threats. When a megalomaniac's illusion of control is challenged, they bypass ethical combat, opting for absolute psychological annihilation. She fixates on the digital feed, battling catastrophic ideation. Simultaneously, Kale's transport halts at an undisclosed establishment excised from public consciousness. No branding, no human sentinels, it's merely an architectural facade reinforced with tinted glass and optic surveillance. Kale breaches the perimeter. The barrier yields before manual contact is required, proving his absolute authority in this space. The interior environment is bathed in a dim, sensory-depriving amber hue built for illicit operations. The spatial design utilizes heavy leathers and dark woodwork, the standard psychological staging for extrajudicial negotiations. An employee approaches, confirming the target is isolated on the upper level. Kale omits social pleasantries, tracking her ascent up a confined stairwell. The room is an interrogation space. One surface, dual seating, 0 escape vectors. The narcissist occupies the defensive position. Adrian is dressed in immaculate white, his facial muscles locked into an artificial mask of placidity. Clinically, his morphology is banal. His standard symmetry allows him to camouflage within elite mild society while maintaining a polished facade. As the predator breaches the room, the narcissist initiates a dominance ritual, rising to project height and extending a hand in feigned diplomacy. The subject expresses polite gratitude for the meeting. Kale rejects the contact, sitting with flawless somatic regulation. He deposits the dossier between them. The megalomaniac maintains his synthetic grin, yet an ocular shift toward the document betrays sudden anxiety. He deploys a verbal probe, fishing for the parameters of Kale's bond with the victim. Kale starves him of data, stating coldly no such intimacy exists. The narcissist demands the logic of this intervention. Kale provides the clinical diagnosis. A critical error was executed. Adrian tilts his head, a motion simulating innocent inquiry, though the predatory calculus is obvious. He asks to define the error. Kale isolates the exact territorial infraction, a physical breach of his property. Let us examine the exact moment a predator realizes he is cornered. The temperature in the room plummets. Adrian's smile, a classic defense mechanism of the megalomaniac narcissist, fades slightly. He claims he was simply delivering flowers to an old friend. Kale coldly observes that Adrian was merely announcing his presence to intimidate a subject under his protection. Adrian counters with soft, practiced laughter, stating Sarafina is a grown adult who needs no protection, framing his stalking as a mere attempt to make amends. Kale leans forward. His pale eyes lock onto Adrian with a terrifying focus. Open the folder. Adrian hesitates, then flips the cover. His mask remains intact as he scans the pages, but the microscopic tightening of his fingers reveals his panic. What is this? Adrian asks quietly. The contents are a textbook behavioral pattern of malignant control. Financial records exposing shell companies used to fund private surveillance operations. Email transcripts proving he hired as investigators to track 7 different women without their knowledge. More damning is the testimony from 4 of those women, outlining severe patterns of psychological manipulation and coercive control. Adrian closes the folder with deliberate care. His face remains smooth, a practiced facade, but something violently cold flickers behind his eyes. He calls it absurd. He claims it is a fabrication, arguing that anyone can forge documents or bribe witnesses. Kale simply sits back. You are right, Kale replies. They can, but they did not. Adrian's jaw tightens. You and I are going to unpack this power dynamic together. What do you want? Adrian demands. Kale's voice drops into a lower, more dangerous register. He demands that Sarafina Voss is no longer Adrian's concern. No contact, no approaching her, no flowers, no messages, no private investigators. Adrian must completely forget she exists. And if I do not, Adrian challenges. Kale's expression does not waver, but the threat living in his silence is absolute. Adrian stares for a long moment before letting out an actual laugh. He leans on his grandiose delusions, asking if Kale has any idea who he is or the connections he commands. He threatens to make one phone call and shut down Kale's restaurant for health violations. You could try, Cale says. I could do more than try, Adrian sneers. Cale leans forward again. This time, his voice is soft, almost gentle, a psychiatric marker of true sociopathic confidence. He tells Adrian that while he is a successful and well-connected man, he has made a critical miscalculation. Adrian arrogantly asks what that might be. Cale explains that Adrian confuses power with knowing the right people and inducing fear. His pale eyes do not blink as he dissects the flaw. That is not power, Cale notes. That is merely leverage, and leverage only functions when the opposing party actually cares about the consequences. Adrian's confident smile begins to falter. Cale quietly continues, explaining that he does not care about health violations, negative press, legal threats, or political ties. He cares about exactly one thing right now: making sure you never come near Sarafina again. She is mine, Adrian snaps. She is not, Cale replies, the words cutting through the clinical air like a scalpel. Adrian's composure finally shatters. His face hardens as his narcissism flares. He insists they have real history, claiming he loved her and took care of her when she was falling apart. He truly believes his own twisted narrative of salvation. But Cale's expression goes absolutely cold. He correctly diagnoses the abuse. You isolated her, monitored her communications, and controlled her finances, Cale says. You convinced her that abuse was affection. That is not love. That is ownership. Adrian stands abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood. He declares the conversation over. Cale does not move a muscle. Sit down, Cale commands. Adrian issues a reflexively arrogant excuse me, but Cale repeats the order. Something in his tone triggers a primal instinct in Adrian, the kind that recognizes authentic danger sitting just 3 feet away. He obeys. Cale produces a second folder, thinner than the first, and slides it across the table. Adrian opens it, and the blood drains from his face. The file contains undeniable evidence of financial crimes, transactions flagged by the SEC, offshore accounts, securities fraud buried so deeply that Adrian believed it would never be unearthed. Where did you get this? He whispers, the reality of his ruin taking hold. I have people who specialize in finding things, Cale says. Adrian stammers that he cannot do this. Cale calmly replies, I already did. Cale maintains a perfectly flat emotional baseline. He states the SEC has received an anonymous tip and is investigating. Adrian's board will receive notice within 72 hours. Adrian's hand begins to tremble, revealing his internal collapse. You are bluffing, he says. Call my bluff, Cale responds. I have watched many narcissists cycle through these exact emotions: shock, rage, fear, and calculation before settling on respect for a superior predator. What do you want? Adrian asks again, quieter this time. Cale repeats his singular demand to stay away from Sarafina. Adrian is baffled that his entire career could burn over one woman. I have not destroyed anything yet, Cale notes calmly, smoothing his tailored suit jacket with absolute precision. Right now, you are merely facing an investigation, Cale explains. It is uncomfortable and expensive, but entirely survivable if you have capable lawyers. But if I do not stay away from her, Adrian pushes. Cale's expression finally shifts, his mouth curving into a terrifying mimicry of a smile. Then the evidence goes to the FBI and the IRS. It goes to every media outlet in New York, your investors, your board, and your wife. Adrian freezes completely. You are married, Cale asks softly, feigning ignorance. Catherine Mercer, daughter of the senator. He wonders aloud how she would feel knowing her husband has been stalking his ex-girlfriend for 6 months. You would not, Adrian says. I would, Cale replies. Unlike you, I do not make threats I am not prepared to execute. Cale walks to the door, then pauses to deliver the final psychological blow. He outlines the choice clearly. Adrian can walk away from Sarafina and manage an SEC problem, or he can keep pushing and lose his entire reality. Adrian's face is completely ashen, stripped of his grandiose delusions. This is not over, he insists, a last-week defense mechanism. Yes, Cale says quietly. It is. He leaves the room without waiting for a response, denying Adrian the final word. 2 hours later, Sarafina is still hiding in the security office. She is curled into a chair, nursing cold coffee, compulsively watching the surveillance feeds as if her abuser might materialize out of the pixels. When Cale finally walks through the door, she stands up so fast she nearly spills the dark liquid over herself. What happened? She asks. Cale looks unusually human, the adrenaline fading. He drops into the chair beside her. We had a conversation and he is going to leave you alone. She asks if he is sure. Cale explains he gave Adrian a choice between losing her and losing his empire. Men like Adrian, classic megalomaniac narcissists, will always choose self-preservation. She desperately wants to believe this clinical assessment. But her trauma bonding runs deep. She knows Adrian does not react to boundaries normally. What if he does not stop? She whispers. Cale meets her eyes and vows to make him regret it. The cold certainty in his voice terrifies her, suddenly revealing the violent lengths Cale is willing to go to protect her, a weight heavier than the fear itself. I did not ask you to do this, she says quietly. I know, Cale replies. She points out that she never asked him to threaten or investigate her abuser. Again, he simply says he knows. Then why? She asks. Cale's pale eyes lock onto hers. Without wavering, because someone should have, he answers. He tells her that someone should have stepped between them 2 years ago. Someone should have identified the abuse for what it was, and someone should have made him stop. Sarafina's vision blurs with tears, her psychological defenses finally lowering. That is not your responsibility, she argues. Maybe not, he says, but I am making it mine anyway. They sit in complete silence while Manhattan glows beneath them. Eventually, she asks what happens next. Now, he says, you go back to your life. You and I have probably made this mistake, assuming trauma evaporates simply because a physical threat is removed. The mind takes much longer to realize it is safe. Cale tells her to work, sleep, and stop looking over her shoulder. Just like that, she asks, laughing at the absurdity. You think I can stop being afraid? No, he admits, but you can start trying. 3 days pass without a word from Adrian. For a mind conditioned by Stockholm Syndrome, this silence is terrifying. She mechanically goes through her routines, but her nervous system remains locked in high alert. She expects everything to collapse. On the 4th night, she is organizing his study when Cale enters with wine. He asks if she is thirsty. She claims she is working. You are terrified, he notes. Wine helps. He pours 2 glasses without waiting for permission, handing her one. Sarafina accepts it automatically, conditioned to obey commands from powerful men. She mutters she should not drink on the job. You are not on the job, he replies. You are keeping me company. She notes that is not in her job description. Cale offers a faint smile. Consider it a promotion. Despite her anxiety, she almost laughs. They sit in leather chairs overlooking the city. She recognizes the wine. It is French, the very vintage Adrian used to consume while systematically demeaning her tastes. After her 2nd glass, she asks how Cale knew his psychological strategy would work. How did he know Adrian would not escalate the abuse? Cale thoughtfully swirls the liquid in his glass, studying the color. Because I understand men like him, Cale explains. They build their empires entirely on the illusion of control. strip away that illusion, and then they collapse under their own fragility. Sarafina hesitates. But you are also a man who built an empire on control, she points out. Cale's expression remains static, but a shadow flickers in his eyes. The difference, he says quietly, is that I know the boundary between control and cruelty. Adrian does not. Sarafina absorbs this clinical distinction. Did someone teach you that, or did you figure it out yourself? Both, he replies. They sit in a long silence. Eventually, Cale breaks the quiet. I had a sister, he says. Sarafina goes entirely still. This is unprecedented. Cale never discusses his past or the psychological trauma that forged him into the man he is today. Let's examine the baseline trauma. Sarafina asks about his family carefully, like a victim probing a volatile subject. Cale states his sister died of an overdose when he was 19. He doesn't sugarcoat the pathology. He clinically defines her death as an escape from their abusive father. Notice how Sarafina's empathy triggers instantly a classic response from someone conditioned to absorb the pain of dangerous men. She apologizes. He rejects the pity. When she asks if this shared history is why he intervened, Cale admits he recognizes Adrian's psychological manipulation. He identifies the specific pathology of a megalomaniac narcissist. The lesson here is grim but undeniable shared trauma often builds the most unbreakable, dangerous foundations for trust. Describes Adrian's method of abuse perfectly, the specific kind of destruction that leaves no visible marks. When Sarafina asks about Cale's own abusive father, his response is chillingly detached. He simply states the man learned what happens when you push a victim too far. We can deduce a lethal retaliation here. 1 week later, the behavioral pattern of the megalomaniac narcissist reemerges. Sarafina is walking home when she spots Adrian across the street. Her physiological response is instantaneous. Her body locks up completely. Groceries slip from her paralyzed fingers. Apples scattering into the gutter. Adrian doesn't move. He merely observes her terror. The abuser feeds on the physical manifestation of his lingering psychological control over her. You and I have seen this manipulation tactic before in extreme case files. Adrian smiles not with overt malice, but with a calculated, melancholic warmth. He mouths the words, "I miss you." It is a masterful deployment of cognitive dissonance designed to trigger her Stockholm syndrome.
Sarafina immediately dissociates.
Her vision tunnels and her breathing becomes erratic. Her survival instincts scream for flight, but systemic abuse paralyzes her motor functions. Then an intervention disrupts the dynamic. Cale steps directly into her line of sight, physically severing the visual tether between predator and prey. He demands her focus. He commands her to breathe. He aggressively replaces the narcissist's psychological anchor with his own grounded, immediate reality. Her nervous system slowly regulates under Cale's clinical instruction. The panic recedes just enough for rational thought to return. She whispers a question. Terrified, the predator is still lingering nearby. Cale scans the perimeter with the cold, predatory assessment of a territorial alpha. Adrian is gone. The adrenaline crash hits Sarafina instantly, and she collapses onto the curb. She believed the boundaries had been set, but narcissists view boundaries merely as challenges. Cale crouches beside her, offering proximity without demanding physical contact, a crucial detail for a trauma victim. He immediately transitions from protector to hunter. He makes a phone call, his voice devoid of emotion, but laced with absolute lethal intent. The hunt has begun. Cale dismisses whatever logistical excuses his security team offers over the phone. He demands immediate location data. This is not a man who waits for the legal system. This is a man accustomed to enforcing his own brutal parameters. He orders Sarafina to her feet. He discards the dropped groceries, irrelevant variables now, and marches her back to the secure environment. The building's control room is a hive of elevated heart rates and frantic coordination. Marcus is cross-referencing street cameras. Cale bypasses the chaos and demands visual confirmation. The monitor displays Adrian executing his psychological strike. He stands perfectly still for exactly 90 seconds, then vanishes. The narcissist doesn't need to attack physically. He only needs to prove he can. The subject vanished into the transit system, fully aware of the surveillance. This signifies a major escalation. Adrian is no longer just stalking his victim. He is engaging Cale in a game of dominance. From the doorway, Sarafina observes this psychological shift in her protector. She sees past the polished exterior to the core pathology beneath a calculated, ruthless operator. This is the mind that built an empire in the criminal shadows. Cale issues new directives with absolute authority. The perimeter must be sealed. No anomalies within a 50-foot radius. He then dictates Sarafina's movements, confining her to the penthouse. To him, it is a necessary protective measure. To a victim of extreme control, however, it terrifyingly mirrors her past captivity. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Sarafina attempts to assert her autonomy. She insists she has a life to live outside those walls. Cale counters with harsh factual reality. She has a stalker who just violated a direct territorial warning. His tone remains perfectly flat, but the underlying threat toward Adrian is unmistakable. The parameters of engagement have changed. That night, Sarafina exhibits classic hyperarousal, a standard post-traumatic response. Sleep is impossible. Her brain obsessively loops the visual of Adrian's sad, manipulative smile. It is the insidious nature of the trauma bond. The abuser twists terror until it almost mimics romance. Defeated by her own neurochemistry, she abandons the bedroom at 3 a.m. She finds Cale in the kitchen. He is operating on a hyper-vigilant frequency, completely consumed by the pathology of the hunt. The marble counter is buried beneath a comprehensive intelligence dossier on Adrian. We are analyzing financial records, communication logs, and extensive surveillance photographs. When Sarafina asks what this evidence represents, Cale simply says it is everything. His physical exhaustion is evident, his eyes bloodshot from sleep deprivation, yet his focus is singular and terrifying. He admits his initial strategy of intimidation failed. The narcissist called his bluff. Cale systematically stacks the folders. He states, with a chilling lack of affect, that the polite warnings have concluded. The psychological shift into warfare is absolute. Sarafina asks the crucial question, terrified of the violence she senses building within him. Cale's response is the classic rationalization of a sociopathic protector. He will do whatever it takes. He analyzes Adrian's behavior not as a crime of passion, but as an act of blatant territorial defiance. Adrian looked at her like property, and Cale's own dominance hierarchy cannot tolerate such a challenge. Sarafina begins to shake, pleading with him to avoid actions he might regret. Cale's assurance that he will feel no remorse is clinically accurate. He details Adrian's psychological warfare. He notes how the megalomaniac systematically isolated her, dismantled her reality, and conditioned her to equate total psychological subjugation with genuine affection. Cale recounts how Adrian hunted her for 6 months after her initial escape. He issues a definitive ruling that behavior ends immediately. This is where we observe the complex duality of her psychological state. Cale's capacity for violence is objectively terrifying, yet to a victim who has never been defended, it feels profoundly comforting. A healthy mind would flee from Cale's darkness, but Sarafina carries the deep scars of abuse. A suppressed, vengeful part of her psyche actually wants to watch her tormentor burn. She surrenders to the dynamic, asking what role she must play. Cale covers her hand with his. Unlike Adrian's punitive, controlling grip, Cale's touch is calibrated and grounding. He asks only for her absolute trust in his methods. She grants him that trust, and the depth of her sincerity is a fascinating study in trauma bonding, shifting toward a new, lethal protector. 2 days later, Cale executes a surgical strike against the narcissist's carefully constructed public facade. Adrian's high-profile wife files for divorce. The humiliation is broadcast across the morning news, citing betrayals and hidden deviance. Sarafina reads the report multiple times, her brain struggling to process the sudden destruction of her abuser's untouchable status. Cale enters the room, physically exerted from a run, but mentally entirely focused on the fallout. He doesn't ask if she saw the news. He knows she did. The psychological warfare has now officially transitioned into the unforgiving public arena. She questions his methods, and Cale casually admits he dismantled Adrian's life with pure truth. He exposed the surveillance, the infidelity, and the specific psychological torture inflicted on Sarafina. Cale rationalizes this as giving the wife the reality she deserved. Sarafina points out that the narcissist will immediately recognize the architect of his ruin. Cale welcomes this. He wants Adrian to feel the sting of vulnerability. The retaliation arrives 36 hours later. Anonymous complaints trigger simultaneous government inspections across Cale's business empire. It is a weak, bureaucratic counterattack, easily deflected by Cale's massive legal machinery, but the underlying message is undeniable. It is a declaration of total war between two apex predators. Cale processes this escalation without a single spike in his pulse rate. He terminates the phone call and issues a direct command she must pack immediately. Her instinct to resist, to maintain her fragile illusion of normalcy, flares up defensively, but Cale overrides her with cold, immovable logic. The megalomaniac is spiraling, making the immediate environment a volatile threat matrix. They depart Manhattan under the cover of dusk in an unmarked armored vehicle. Cale drives himself, eliminating all secondary personnel to ensure absolute operational security. When she asks their destination, he reveals a hidden asset in Connecticut. It is a classic maneuver for a man of his nature. You always maintain off-grid locations that do not exist on public paper. Now, we reach the crux of their dynamic as the city fades in the rearview mirror. Sarafina attempts to offer him an exit strategy. She suggests he could have simply terminated her employment and avoided the conflict entirely. It is a textbook manifestation of low self-worth born from chronic abuse. Cale's grip tightens on the wheel. He rejects the concept of taking the easy path. When she presses for his underlying motive, his defense mechanisms slip just a fraction. He admits that she matters to him. To a man accustomed to viewing people as disposable assets, this is a profound psychological confession. He refuses to let a lesser predator destroy something he values. The lesson is simple sometimes. Surviving a monster requires walking in the shadow of another. Let us examine the environmental shift. The Connecticut residence lacks the sterile grandeur of the Manhattan penthouse. It features organic materials, wood floors, stone fireplaces, surrounded by dense timberland, rather than a glowing urban grid. When Kyle deposits her in a softly lit guest quarters, instructing her to sleep, Her hypervigilance prevents rest. You and I must understand the clinical reality here. Sarafina's nervous system is entirely compromised. She lies immobilized, processing the threat of Adrian Mercer, a megalomaniac narcissist like Adrian, currently facing marital abandonment and corporate investigations, has suffered a total collapse of his narcissistic supply. This structural deficit makes his behavioral pathology violently unpredictable. Exhaustion eventually overrides her cortisol's spikes, pulling her into a fragmented sleep cycle. She wakes to olfactory stimuli, fresh coffee, and discovers Kyle engaged in an intensely domestic ritual, preparing eggs, toast, and fruit. To the untrained eye, it mimics stability. Yet, for a subject suffering trauma bonding, this sudden normalcy registers as psychological ache. He greets her without shifting his visual focus. She accepts the beverage, settling into a clinical silence. Kyle systematically outlines his countermeasure. Legal counsel is filing a restraining order against Adrian today. He notes that while injunctions do not permanently stop a megalomaniac, they establish a necessary framework of legal consequences. Sarafina merely offers a hollow nod. Kyle details the external pressures accelerating Adrian's psychological decompensation. The federal investigation is advancing rapidly, and his corporate board is preparing to sever ties. Kyle formulates a precise behavioral timeline. Within 14 days, Adrian will either vanish or enter an acute narcissistic rage, leading to desperate measures. When Kyle states that he will personally neutralize the threat, his ocular fixation is chillingly flat. Rather than soothing her amygdala, this absolute certainty induces profound dread. Sarafina recognizes that Kyle's methodology of conflict resolution operates outside normative ethical boundaries. In a whisper, she begs him not to disintegrate his own psychological architecture in the pursuit of dismantling Adrian's. Kyle maintains prolonged visual contact before descending to her physical elevation, a calculated maneuver to establish dominance disguised as intimacy. He draws a firm cognitive boundary, stating his actions are purely protective, not destructive. When she questions his certainty, his response reveals his core pathology. Destruction equates to a loss of control, an outcome he categorically rejects. As he methodically clears the plates, Sarafina is left to analyze his rigid behavioral framework. She contemplates the very nature of his psychological scaffolding. Is this obsessive environmental mastery a genuine form of safety, or merely another restrictive enclosure? We see her trading the volatile cage of a narcissist for the chillingly sterile terrarium of a control absolute. A 5-day incubation period follows. Diurnally, Kyle executes his corporate functions remotely, projecting authority over a vast network from his isolated kitchen table. Nocturnally, their interactions shift into deep psychological disclosures by the hearth. He recounts his early capital accumulation, glossing over legally ambiguous origins. Fascinatingly, Sarafina discusses her abandoned academic research on coercive control, demonstrating acute self-awareness that she could be the subject of her own clinical study. By the 5th rotation, the anticipatory anxiety breaches her defenses. She interrogates him regarding their return to the active threat zone. Bathed in the thermal glow, Kyle delivers his stark prognosis. Adrian will either be eradicated or enact his own eradication. Sarafina attempts to challenge his predictive certainty, but Kyle's response is rooted in extensive historical data. He calmly catalogues his prior engagements with hostile entities far exceeding Adrian's capacity, asserting his superiority in both resources and operational ruthlessness. He guarantees her survival, beneath the surface. He dissects his prior tactical error, extending diplomatic protocols to a subject incapable of rational processing. He had projected neurotypical logic onto a clinically disordered narcissist. Detaching his seatbelt, he formally concludes all polite methodologies. Before her cognitive processing can catch up, his physical momentum carries him toward the elevator. She scrambles to follow his rapid spatial advancement. The tension in the confined vertical cylinder is absolutely suffocating. A dangerous spike in her trauma response prompts an irrational proposal. She offers to present herself to her abuser. Kyle abruptly halts this self-destructive ideation. He deconstructs Adrian's presence, not as a request for communication, but as a calculated mechanism of terror. It demonstrates omnipotence, designed to prove her sanctuary is illusory and his reach is absolute. Kyle accurately diagnoses the tactic as overt psychological warfare. Modulating his vocal frequency, he assures her, this is a shared theater of combat. The doors retract on the 42nd level, revealing a highly stressed Marcus. The security parameters have failed. Adrian is relying on the legal loophole of a public architectural space to maintain his unrelenting psychological siege. Kyle's executive function engages with lethal precision. He commands Marcus to transport the primary subject to the secured penthouse enclosure, instituting a total restriction on the entryway. When Sarafina attempts to assert autonomy and insert herself into the confrontation, Kyle definitively blocks the behavioral loop. Maintaining direct optical lock, he mandates her isolation for preservation. Before her argument can fully formulate, Marcus applies gentle physical redirection, escorting her into the fortified corridor. Glancing backward, she witnesses Kyle's descent into the active hazard zone. Below, the expansive lobby architecture is devoid of human variables, save for the pathological entity himself, Adrian Mercer, occupying a leather fixture with chilling composure. Observe the narcissist in his curated camouflage premium textiles, flawlessly styled keratin, projecting the artificial calm of a corporate negotiation, wish-gain, rather than a psychological blockade. As Kyle breaches the space, Adrian executes a fluid ascension, offering a synthetic expression of gratitude. Kyle completely ignores the social prompt. He advances with calibrated basic think until he violates Adrian's spatial perimeter, halting a mere 3 feet away. An anxious security guard hovers peripherally. Without breaking his predatory fixation on Adrian's pupils, Kyle issues a verbal directive to clear the environment. The guard's hesitation is swiftly eradicated. The secondary variable evacuates immediately, leaving the two opposing apex pathologies entirely isolated. Let us examine the environmental factors of this confrontation. Rain lashes against the floor-to-ceiling glass, blurring the dark metropolis outside, a fitting pathetic fallacy for the psychological fog filling the room. Kyle, attempting to establish dominance, accuses Adrian of violating their agreement. But Adrian, displaying the classic defiance of a megalomaniac narcissist, simply tilts his head. He acknowledges no boundaries. He claims a shared history with Sarafina, dismissing Kyle's protective stance as mere intimidation. Kyle maintains a flat effect, his eyes going dead, as he accurately categorizes Adrian's behavior, staring at a trauma victim until she suffers a panic attack isn't history, Kyle notes. It is clinical harassment. Today, you and I are going to unpack the architecture of this toxic triad. Notice how the narcissist's mask slips when challenged. Adrian's calm facade fractures, replaced by the textbook defense of the manipulator, minimizing the abuse. He cites the legality of standing on a street and sending flowers, weaponizing mundane actions. He steps closer, employing physical proximity as a dominance tactic, and claims he loved her. In his mind, he was the benevolent caretaker, blind to the fact that his caretaking was pure control. Kyle points out that Adrian was systematically destroying her psyche, but the manipulator always holds a trump card. Adrian reaches into his coat. Kyle prepares for physical violence, but the true weapon in this scenario is psychological. Adrian produces a smartphone. A digital artifact is often far more destructive than any blade. Adrian presents his exhibit with clinical precision, noting the footage is from 8 months ago, exactly 3 weeks before her disappearance. He rotates the screen to display a restaurant. There is Sarafina, engaging in intimate body language with another man, is touching his hand. She is projecting a lightness Kyle has never witnessed in her traumatized state. Adrian narrates the footage like a prosecutor. The man is Marcus Chen. They had been involved for 6 weeks. Adrian recounts confronting her, noting how she labeled him paranoid and controlling. In psychiatric terms, this is a fascinating inversion. The video concludes with the pair leaving in an embrace. The life lesson here is stark. A captured mind will desperately seek any exit, even if it requires complete deceit. Kyle experiences an acute physiological stress response. His chest constricts as the narrative shifts. Adrian confesses to hiring investigators to validate his suspicions, claiming Sarafina was the one gaslighting him. The video ceases. Adrian secures the device and projects an affectation of profound betrayal. This is the hallmark of the megalomaniac narcissist co-opting the victimhood narrative. He rationalizes his extreme surveillance monitoring communications, tracking coordinates as the justifiable actions of a wounded lover. His voice fractures precisely on cue. He insists he merely sought closure, a need to comprehend why she abandoned their construct. Kyle remains completely immobilized, experiencing the cognitive dissonance of a protector who realizes his map of reality is fundamentally flawed. Kyle's neurological pathways are misfiring, rapidly searching for variables that could expose the footage as a fabrication. Yet, the evidence possesses a high degree of fidelity. He accuses Adrian of deceit, but his vocal projection lacks conviction. Adrian seizes the psychological advantage. He instructs Kyle to interrogate Sarafina directly about the investment banker, the Chelsea restaurant, and the fabricated late-night shifts. The narcissist's features solidify into a mask of righteous indignation as he points out her critical omission. Kyle's hands form tight fists as he orders the man to leave. Adrian complies, but cannot resist a final reframing of the dynamic. He declares himself the injured party, a simple man wronged by deception, Mr. Duval. He must always control the final narrative, no matter the cost. Adrian delivers his parting diagnosis with chilling accuracy, warning Kyle to uncover the remaining falsehoods before his protective instincts ruin him. The manipulator exits, leaving a vacuum of silence broken only by the rhythmic impact of rain against the architecture. Kyle remains catatonic. His entire cognitive framework regarding the past 3 weeks is undergoing a catastrophic structural collapse, reassembling into a deeply disturbing pattern. 40 minutes later, we observe Sarafina exhibiting classic hyperarousal in the penthouse. She paces, her nervous system flooded with cortisol. She bombards Kyle with frantic questions upon his arrival, but aborts mid-sentence. Kyle's facial micro-expressions are entirely absent. It is a dissociative blankness. He simply requests data on Marcus Chen. Let us observe her immediate physiological reaction together. The introduction of the name triggers a severe, autonomic response. Blood drains from her face. Tremors begin in her extremities. Kyle processes these somatic markers and confirms the diagnosis. The narcissist's intel was accurate. Sarafina attempts verbal mitigation, but Kyle demands a binary answer regarding the infidelity. His tone is suppressed, indicating intense, suppressed hostility. Her eyes fill with tears as she confesses. Kyle initiates a physical withdrawal, moving to his study to self-medicate with ethanol. Sarafina pursues him, trapped in a panic cycle. He states the empirical fact of her deception. She attempts a semantic defense, clinging to the reality of the abuse she suffered while ignoring her own omissions. Kyle clinically dissects her narrative strategy. He identifies the deliberate exclusion of crucial variables, her active deception, her betrayal, and the behavioral anomalies that triggered Adrian's pathological suspicion. Sarafina's nervous system remains compromised as she tries to articulate the etiology of her actions. She describes the classic symptoms of narcissistic subjugation: feeling asphyxiated, heavily monitored, entirely dehumanized. The introduction of a newer variable, Marcus, provided a brief normalization of her humanity. She minimizes the interaction to 3 non-sexual encounters, emphasizing emotional validation over physical intimacy. Yet, the core pathology remains. She fabricated a reality for her abuser. She justifies this with anticipatory trauma, knowing the explosive retaliation the truth would provoke. She accurately predicts the abuser's behavioral loop. He would distort the infraction to retrospectively validate his pre-existing control matrix. However, Kyle introduces a dangerous hypothesis, suggesting her actions were the catalyst for the abuse rather than a symptom of it. This verbal strike causes a severe loss of equilibrium. Sarafina literally recoils. Kyle's certainty is entirely shattered. He recounts her initial presentation 3 weeks prior. The traumatized affect, the documented psychological torment. He enumerates the extreme countermeasures he executed on her behalf: the espionage, the intimidation, the systemic dismantling of a high-level threat's life. He initiated a high-stakes conflict based on incomplete intelligence. Beneath his controlled delivery, the structural integrity of his identity is fracturing. He indicts her for the fundamental omission of her own complicity in the trust deficit. She attempts to invalidate this data point, claiming it lacks relevance to the abuse. This triggers a sudden, explosive vocalization from Kyle, a rare breach of his emotional containment that causes her to physically flinch. He employs a somatic reset, closing his eyes to regulate his breathing and lower his heart rate. When he resumes communication, his affect is clinical and absolute. He commands her to vacate the premises. Sarafina's psychological scaffolding collapses. She misinterprets this as a simple termination of employment. Kyle corrects her. He is executing a protocol to eliminate an unpredictable variable. He refuses further auditory input, recognizing that her previous testimonies were highly curated constructs. Kyle challenges her core identity. He frames her not as a casualty, but as an agent avoiding accountability for her behavioral deviations. The accusation inflicts profound psychological trauma. He moves to the window, staring at the urban grid below. He outlines the foundational premise of his success: superior threat assessment and an immunity to psychological manipulation. Yet, her display of distress bypassed all his cognitive firewalls. He accepted her narrative without verifying the telemetry. He is experiencing profound identity crisis. Realizing he deployed his resources as a proxy in a conflict he misunderstood, Sarafina's motor function fails completely, dropping her into a chair. She reiterates the truth of the abuse, separating her flawed actions from Adrian's disproportionate, pathological response. She catalogues the modalities of coercive control she endured: the surveillance, the forced isolation, the systematic gaslighting designed to erode her reality. Kyle acknowledges the data with deep auditory fatigue. However, he establishes a firm boundary: prior victimization does not authorize current deception. She attempts a semantic defense, but Kyle correctly classifies omission as active deceit. A heavy auditory void fills the room, scored only by the relentless precipitation. The external environment remains static, but their interpersonal paradigm is irrevocably shattered. When she asks what he wants, he demands cognitive empathy. He needs her to comprehend the impossibility of operating in an environment devoid of reliable intelligence. You cannot protect an asset that actively feeds you misinformation. Kyle voices the symptom of a compromised handler, the psychological sensation of being played. Sarafina's internal diagnostic confirms his hypothesis. She curated the data. She constructed a binary narrative of monstrous abuser and flawless victim, weaponizing Kyle's savior complex. It is a classic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim becomes so psychologically entwined with their captor's reality that they manipulate their new environment to survive the old one. Yet, she wrestles with the ethical calculus: does a victim's flawed defense mechanism exonerate the abuser's pathology? Kyle issues the final directive for her extraction. When she cites a lack of resources, he deploys a rapid financial solution. He executes a digital transfer of $20,000. It is a sterile, purely economic severing of their complex emotional bond. Let's look at this final exchange. You and I. He categorizes the funds as simple severance, stripping the interaction of any warmth. The absolute finality in his tone dismantles her remaining psychological defenses. She experiences severe motor tremors as she moves toward the exit. She offers an apology, acknowledging the incomplete intelligence she provided and the surrogate warfare she authorized. But observe her crucial assertion of autonomy. She feels no remorse for escaping this narcissist's matrix, nor for her own biological imperative to survive. Kyle offers zero auditory feedback. The variable has been eliminated. She executes her departure protocol in precisely 15 minutes. Her existence condenses into 2 canvas bags. Among the mundane items lies a single text on coercive control, a quiet relic of a shattered sanctuary. You and I will unpack this clinical case file together, starting at a point of acute psychological collapse. Marcus appears in the doorway as Sarafina finishes zipping her bag. "Need a ride?" he asks. She deflects, claiming that she will take the subway at 2 in the morning. He shakes his head. "Come on, I'll drive you." Her psychic depletion is absolute. She cannot resist. They descend in the elevator in total silence. Marcus loads her belongings into a town car. "Where to?" he asks. She dictates the address of a Brooklyn shelter, the exact sanctuary she used 6 months prior, when first fleeing Adrian, the megalomaniac narcissist of our study. Halfway across the bridge, Marcus breaks his neutral behavioral baseline. "For what it's worth, I believe you." Sarafina's hypervigilance triggers instantly. She looks at him sharply. "What? About Adrian? About what he did to you?" Marcus keeps his eyes fixed on the road. "I've worked for Mr. Duval for 8 years. I've never seen him react to anyone the way he reacted to your situation." He observes that his employer, a dominant personality, only shields those in true peril. Whatever Adrian showed him tonight shook him bad enough to doubt himself, and Mr. Duval never doubts himself. Her trauma defenses flare. "So, You're saying I deserve this, Marcus replies clinically.
I'm saying the truth is probably more complicated than either of you wants to admit.
They drive in silence until he leaves her. The psychological lesson is stark survival demands confronting our own damage. You need anything, you call me, Marcus states, establishing a support tether. Her paranoia, a symptom of captivity trauma, surfaces. Why would you help me? You work for Kyle. Marcus separates his duty from morality, because working for someone doesn't mean agreeing with everything they do. He hands her a card and she accepts it with numb fingers before he departs. She stands isolated on a Brooklyn street at 2:47 in the morning, burdened with $20,000 she views as tainted. The clinical reality of displacement soon sets in. The shelter is at maximum capacity. An exhausted clerk hands her list of its alternatives. Serafina's downward spiral continues as she takes a bed in a Lower East Side youth hostel, a space saturated with profound urban desperation. Let us examine her psychological pressure cooker. $50 a night, walls leaking the sounds of strangers. She lies on the narrow mattress, fighting a complete mental fracture. Then, a stimulus. Her phone buzzes, an unknown number. Her nervous system spikes. The text reads, "I heard you left Kyle's employment. If you need somewhere to stay, my door is always open. Adrian." The megalomaniac narcissist uses omnipresence as a weapon of terror, tracking her movements. She deletes the text and blocks the contact, a futile gesture of control. Immediately, a different number vibrates. Running away again. You're good at that, but you can't run from the truth forever. This is the precise methodology of a behavioral predator. They prove that the psychological cage has no doors. The psychological breaking point manifests physically. She hurls her phone against the wall. Pulling the blanket over her head, the emotional dam ruptures. Weeps for the first time in 3 weeks, a necessary release of built-up cortisol. 3 days pass in a dissociative fugue state. She wanders unfamiliar streets, subsisting on cheap coffee and the safety of anonymity. She tries to build a survival baseline, applying for cash labor that demands no questions. The void offers zero response. On the 4th morning, an unknown number rings. Her conditioned avoidance almost wins, but a primal instinct forces her to answer. "Hello, Serafina Voss." The voice is female, professional, and entirely unfamiliar. In the total vacuum of isolation, any voice can simulate a vital tether. "Who is this?" she demands. "My name is Catherine Mercer. I'm Adrian's ex-wife. We need to talk." The somatic response is fast. Serafina jolts upright. "How did you get this number?" Catherine dismisses the privacy breach. "That's not important. I have information about what Adrian is planning." She outlines the pathology of our megalomaniac narcissist. Adrian is not just engaging in obsessive stalking. He is weaponizing the justice system. He plans to sue Kyle Duvall for tortious interference, utilizing Serafina as his primary evidence. Serafina experiences acute vasoconstriction. Her blood runs cold. Catherine explains that Adrian has been meticulously documenting every single interaction. In the hands of a clinical narcissist, the law itself becomes an instrument of abuse. The manipulation of reality is the narcissist's primary tool. Catherine explains Adrian is framing this as a personal vendetta, a powerful man destroying an innocent victim based on the delusions of an unstable ex-girlfriend. "I know it's not true," Catherine admits, but Adrian makes lies look like truth. He has compiled an extensive dossier, video evidence of Serafina, testimony from colleagues regarding her erratic behavior, and financial records of the $20,000 Kyle transferred to her. Catherine's clinical detachment finally softens. He's going to destroy both of you, and unless you do something, he's going to win. Sarafina enters a state of hyperventilation. Why are you telling me this? The response is rooted in the deep scars of shared trauma. Once he decides someone has wronged him, he doesn't stop until they're completely ruined, Catherine warns. The pathology of his vengeance is absolute. She orders a meeting in 2 hours, alone, under strict secrecy. The call terminates. A text materializes a location in Tribeca. Sarafina sits on the mattress, experiencing severe tachycardia. Her brain loops through rapid threat assessments. This could easily be a trap. Catherine might be an active participant in Adrian's psychological warfare. You and I are going to look at this together and decide, is the risk worth the reward? For Sarafina, the paralyzing truth remains. If Adrian is truly constructing a legal offensive against Kyle, her current nightmare is merely the prologue. Fear pushes the victim back into the fire. Driven by hyper-arousal, Sarafina arrives at the Tribeca location 45 minutes early. She procures a black coffee and secures a tactical vantage point in the rear corner, maximizing her visual field of the entrance. Catherine Mercer arrives with precise punctuality. The visual assessment yields surprising data. She is younger than anticipated, early 30s, with blonde hair in a severe ponytail. Her attire projects understated, calculated wealth. She carries the aura of someone who neutralizes psychological crises with superior litigation and strategic foresight. Identifying her target immediately, Catherine crosses the room and enters Sarafina's immediate physical space. "Thank you for coming," she murmurs, sliding smoothly into the opposing chair to begin her clinical work. "I'm not sure I should be here," Sarafina confesses. "You shouldn't," Catherine agrees smoothly, "but you are, which means you're willing to listen." Catherine produces a tablet. Placing it centrally, she outlines the diagnostic criteria of Adrian's obsession. He has been planning this for months. He's meticulous, obsessive. He doesn't leave anything to chance. She accesses a folder. A cascade of data illuminates the screen, drafted legal filings, private investigative reports, and intercepted communication logs. Sarafina experiences a visceral wave of nausea. "He's suing Kyle," she whispers. "Not yet, but he will," Catherine confirms. Adrian has already weaponized bureaucratic institutions, aggressively filing complaints with licensing boards to slowly dismantle Kyle's life. The isolation campaign is vast. Adrian has contacted Kyle's investors, disseminating a fabricated narrative of a dangerous predator ruining an innocent man. "This is insane," Sarafina breathes, stunned by the sociopathy. "This is Adrian," Catherine replies, her vocal effect entirely flat. "This is what he does. He identifies threats. He builds cases. He executes with surgical precision." Sarafina exhibits a visible physical tremor as she reaches for her coffee. "Why are you helping me?" Catherine observes a prolonged silence, calculating her own vulnerability. "Because I spent 5 years married to a man who convinced me I was the problem, that my concerns were paranoia, and when I left, he tried to destroy me. The tragedy of the trauma bond is that survivors recognize each other. Stick with me, we're about to watch a clinical confrontation." Catherine locks eyes. "The only reason I survived is because my father is a senator with resources Adrian couldn't match. You don't have that. Neither does Kyle. Unless someone helps you, Adrian wins." She exposes the brutal power dynamic. Sarafina shifts defensively. "What do you want from me?" The demand is absolute. "I want you to tell the truth. Everything you left out when you told Kyle your story." Sarafina experiences sudden panic. "I told him Catherine interrupts the rationalization. You told him a version. Right now, Adrian is building a narrative where you're an unstable woman who manipulated a powerful man. Unless we prove otherwise, that narrative becomes reality. Catherine remains immovable. Then prove it. The psychological extraction begins. Tell me everything, Catherine demands. The affair, the lies, the reasons Adrian had for not trusting you, and we'll figure out how to use that to destroy his case before he files it. Sarafina stares at this stranger, paralyzed by the prospect of vocalizing the darkest elements of her trauma bond. If I do this, she says slowly, calculating the collateral damage, Kyle will know I lied to him again. Catherine removes the final delusion. He already knows you lied. The question is whether you're going to let that lie destroy both of you, or whether you're going to fight back. The inescapable gravity of that logic settles over Sarafina. She inhales deeply, bypassing her mental blocks, and finally verbalizes the complex psychological trauma. We open the file on Sarafina. She sits in the attorney's office, finally confronting 8 months of avoidance, the affair with Marcus Chen, the lies she spun, the defensive manipulations, all of it recorded. Catherine, the attorney, saves the audio file and locks eyes with her. Let us be clinical here. You and I know there is no such thing as a perfect victim. Sarafina's own trauma responses gave Adrian, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, the ammunition he needed. Catherine states it plainly. Adrian will weaponize her imperfections. The clinical countermeasure, a massive civil strike, harassment, stalking, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We fight pathology with legal force, a reminder that owning our mistakes is the first step to stripping an abuser of their power. Let us open this file and observe the classic cognitive dissonance. Catherine attempts to impose logical risk management, suggesting that proactive narrative control will mitigate Adrian's abuse. Yet, the subject, Sarafina, is trapped in a spiral of guilt regarding Kyle. Notice how Sarafina internalizes the blame, mourning that she dragged an innocent civilian into a war. Catherine advises giving him agency, but Sarafina recognizes that Kyle's defense mechanisms have already triggered. He expelled her from his environment out of a deep sense of betrayal. It is a textbook trauma response from both parties. The lesson here is simple. When trust fractures under the weight of deception, no amount of retroactive honesty can magically rebuild the foundation. Catherine diagnoses the behavior with surgical precision. Omission of truth is not synonymous with apathy. She leaves the subject alone to ruminate in a public space, a highly vulnerable setting for a fractured psyche. Then, the external stimulus arrives, a notification from Marcus. Sarafina processes the data, and her physiological response is immediate. The blood chills. A news article published 20 minutes ago reveals Kyle is the target of a systemic corporate assassination. Allegations of intimidation flood the screen, orchestrated entirely by Adrian. This is the escalation tactic of a megalomaniac narcissist, destroying a rival to isolate the primary victim. We often forget true power is not wealth, but the ability to systematically dismantle another person's peace. The subject experiences a severe acute stress reaction. Her motor control deteriorates as the tremors set in. Adrian did not delay. His strike was calculated and absolute. Driven by an overwhelming sense of culpability, Sarafina initiates a frantic flight response, hailing a taxi to the Upper East Side. 20 minutes later, she returns to the precise geographic location of the initial trauma, Kyle's lobby. The security guard, Marcus, serves as the gatekeeper, his demeanor reflecting the heavy psychological toll of the morning. He gently informs her that the barrier is up. Kyle refuses access. It is a desperate attempt by a drowning woman to mend a ship she herself punctured. Guilt is an incredibly potent motivator, but it rarely produces rational decisions. Marcus bypasses protocol, opening the radio channel to Kyle. The auditory response is clinically fascinating flat, devoid of inflection, entirely detached. Kyle issues an ultimatum, threatening termination to enforce his boundary. The gatekeeper lowers the radio, offering a futile apology. Sarafina's equilibrium completely shatters. She rapidly verbalizes her internal guilt, confessing her role in the media spectacle, desperate to engage in reparative behavior. But then, the visual presentation shifts. Kyle materializes in the elevator structure. His physical deterioration is profound. The wrinkled suit and disordered hair indicate a total collapse of his usual rigid self-regulation. Stress rapidly degrades the facade we present to the world, leaving only raw exhaustion. Notice the ocular cues. His pale eyes are completely hollow, a sign of extreme psychological depletion. Sarafina attempts an intervention, frantically detailing her falsehoods and her desire to correct the damage. But Kyle's pathology is rigid. He clinically dissects her proposition, reminding her that his entire behavioral framework was built on absolute control. By allowing her proximity, he compromised his core operating system. Her intent is irrelevant to him. He processes only the resulting data. His words are perfectly calibrated instruments of emotional laceration. Good intentions cannot reverse the kinetic energy of a deployed weapon. In behavioral profiling, we see this constantly. Actions write the permanent record, not the apologies that desperately follow. Kyle isolates the futility of her remorse. He catalogues the irreversible damage, the legal inquiry, the shattered social standing, the total annihilation of trust. When she begs for a behavioral directive, he offers nothing. He reclaims his autonomy by absorbing the crisis entirely into his own domain, reverting to his solitary coping mechanisms. The 60-second ultimatum and the threat of law enforcement finalize the severance. As the doors seal him away, the subject is left paralyzed, hypersensitive to her own irregular respirations and the physical symptoms of a severe emotional crash. A grounding touch from Marcus is the only tether keeping her anchored. The harshest boundary a person can draw is complete removal. Silence is often a louder condemnation than any scream. Examine this interaction with me. Marcus issues a rational directive for her to evacuate. The subject resists, consumed by the pathological need to repair the unrepairable. When Marcus bluntly invalidates that possibility, the cognitive load forces her into a dissociative state. She returns to her temporary enclosure, standing motionless. Then, the primary stressor re-enters her orbit. The device vibrates. It is Adrian deploying a masterclass in coercive control. He reinforces her guilt, explicitly linking her defiance to Kyle's impending destruction. He positions himself as the omnipotent savior who can erase the legal peril if she merely submits. This is the architecture of psychological subjugation. The abuser manufactures the crisis, only to sell the victim the antidote. The messages display a classic cycle of abuse mechanism, the sudden pivot to weaponized affection. The narcissist claims enduring love, framing submission as a noble sacrifice to prevent collateral damage. The subject evaluates this horrific bargain. We are witnessing the dangerous neurological pathways that lead to a variation of Stockholm Syndrome. Her mind actively rationalizes a return to the environment of her trauma. By adopting the persona of the submissive partner, she can secure Kyle's safety, trading her own psychological survival for his. The ringing of the device shatters the paralysis. Catherine establishes contact, inquiring about the escalating media narrative. True captivity begins the very moment a victim is convinced their own surrender is a deeply virtuous act. Catherine pushes for an aggressive legal counter-offensive, calculating that immediate retaliation is the only viable survival strategy. But the subject's cognitive distortion is fully entrenched. Sarafina verbalizes the false dichotomy planted by her abuser resistance equals Kyle's annihilation, while capitulation ensures his preservation. Catherine correctly identifies the pathological nature of this thought process, pointing out the psychological burden Kyle would carry, forever tethered to her martyrdom. The megalomaniac narcissist thrives on exactly this kind of emotional checkmate. Sarafina's internal logic collapses into a state of pervasive toxicity, concluding her mere existence is a contaminant. The darkest phase of trauma is when the victim believes their own erasure is the cure. The subject abruptly terminates the connection, retreating entirely into isolation. Observe her environment, a sterile, narrow space, perfectly mirroring her internal desolation. Insomnia takes hold as her brain aggressively cycles through threat scenarios. The external world continuously assaults her digital barrier. The abuser, the ally, the media, they all demand engagement. She utilizes severe avoidance behavior, rejecting every stimulus. At exactly 4:23 in the morning, a paradigm shift occurs. The mind rejects both the regression to the captor and the sacrifice of the innocent bystander. She formulates a third variable, a highly risky behavioral intervention. True resolve is rarely born in daylight. It is forged in absolute exhaustion. The subject concludes that delegating her defense has failed. She must initiate direct confrontation. By 6 in the morning, she has positioned herself at the perimeter of his corporate territory. She relies on deeply encoded memories of his routine, the predictable patterns of a rigid narcissist. From a concealed vantage point, she observes his arrival at exactly 6:47. The visual contrast is striking and clinically significant. The aggressor steps out in pristine attire, displaying an unbothered, rested physiological state. He exhibits the chilling tranquility of a predator completely detached from the human devastation he engineers. She tracks his movements with hyper-vigilant focus. The ability of an abuser to function normally while their victim deteriorates is a profound injustice that hardens the spirit. You and I must look at this spatial dynamic. The subject abandons her stationary position and breaches the target location. The architectural environment is deliberately designed to intimidate: expansive glass, cold marble, an acoustic dampening that signals immense financial power. The gatekeeper at the desk employs practiced, algorithmic politeness. When challenged regarding an appointment, Sarafina relies on the psychological reality of their toxic bond. The megalomaniac fundamentally believes he owns her. Therefore, he will never refuse an opportunity to gloat over her perceived submission. She weaponizes her own identity, commanding the receptionist to transmit her name. Sometimes the only way to infiltrate an impenetrable fortress is to present the exact offering the tyrant craves to control. Let us examine the micro-expressions of the peripheral characters. The receptionist processes the input, and her facial parameters shift a blend of empathetic pity and morbid curiosity. The subject's reputation precedes her. Clearance is granted to the 48th floor. As the mechanical transport ascends, Sarafina analyzes her own reflection in the metallic surface. She catalogues her physical degradation: the hollowed eyes, the profound exhaustion of prolonged psychological warfare. Clinically speaking, she recognizes the strategic value of this deterioration. To pacify an apex predator, the prey must appear entirely defeated. She embraces the aesthetic of the broken victim. Deception requires total commitment, and the best lies are built from a foundation of visible truths. Let us open the case file on Adrian Mercer. Picture the environment floor to ceiling glass, stark furniture. A space engineered entirely to project dominance. When Sarafina steps into this enclosure, she is stepping back into the cage. Adrian finishes a call, turns, and offers a smile that lacks any genuine empathy. It is the calculated warmth of a megalomaniac assessing his subject. He remarks on her haggard appearance. She demands he drop the litigation against Kyle Duval. His response is a textbook display of emotional withholding. He simply asks why he would do such a thing, waiting for her to offer herself as the collateral. The lesson here is simple control often disguises itself as calm patience. We must carefully observe the behavioral loop activating here. Adrian demands a confession, an admission of her perceived betrayals. Sarafina, entirely compromised by the psychological pressure, begins to recite her sins. She admits to lying, to manipulating the narrative, to destroying his trust. Her physical reaction, fists clenched, severe tremors, indicates profound distress, a hallmark of what we call a trauma bond, akin to Stockholm syndrome. She is internalizing his pathology, adopting his version of reality where his extreme surveillance was somehow justified by her actions. When she finishes, Adrian offers only a clinical, empty validation. He notes that it must have been difficult to say, feeding entirely on her degradation. In criminal analysis, we call this the absolute concession. Sarafina offers to completely erase her own existence to protect Kyle Duval. She promises to leave the city, sever all contact, and effectively become a ghost. Adrian evaluates this sacrifice with predatory interest. He questions her motive for shielding a man who simply tried to intervene. Sarafina attempts a moment of defiance, stating plainly that neither of them is innocent. But Kyle does not deserve to burn for her mistakes. Then comes the pivot. Adrian moves toward the glass, looking down at the city he believes he owns. He asks if she loves Duval. Notice how the megalomaniac cannot process altruism. He can only comprehend possession and rivalry. That specific question destabilizes her baseline. Does she love him? She cannot articulate an answer. But to Adrian, the distinction is vital to his ego. He clinically dissects the timeline, 2 years of his careful, suffocating investment versus her brief interactions with a virtual stranger. His tone remains unnervingly gentle, a classic interrogation technique designed to extract vulnerability. He states a need to understand what this rival possesses that he lacks. Internally, Sarafina is experiencing a violent psychological reaction. She knows the truth. Duval never subjected her to relentless tracking or convinced her that psychological imprisonment was a form of affection. Yet, the trauma bond silences her scream. You and I have probably both seen this tragic cycle before. The victim realizes her own hands are not entirely clean. She used Duval, pulling him into a highly toxic orbit he could not comprehend. When she quietly admits Duval made her feel secure, Adrian reacts. His narcissistic injury flares. He insists he provided safety and protection. Sarafina pushes back, stating love does not require a tracking device. Adrian deflects masterfully, weaponizing her recent deceit against her, asking what lying looks like. It is a calculated strike at her remaining self-esteem, reminding her of the weeks she played the victim while hiding her own missteps. Defeated, she abandons the argument, offering her surrender to spare an innocent man. Consider the physical props used in coercion. Adrian retrieves a thick 27-page legal document detailing the financial and social execution of Kyle Duval. It is a tangible weapon placed deliberately between them. When she begs him to withdraw the strike, Adrian sets his hook. He demands more than a simple apology. He demands complete regression. He wants her to return to the cage, to resume their relationship, to let him prove their bond was genuine. The clinical audacity of the megalomaniac is staggering. He equates extortion with romance. Sarafina correctly identifies the severe pathology in his request, calling him insane. But a diagnosis offers absolutely no protection against a predator with leverage. Adrian reframes his extreme coercion as heroic dedication. He calmly points out that Duval has already discarded her, firing her and severing ties. In contrast, Adrian positions himself as the sole provider of stability and security. It is the ultimate psychological isolation tactic. As Sarafina instinctively retreats toward the exit, his tone shifts to cold, systematic destruction. He outlines exactly how the 15-year empire Duval built will collapse, ensuring Sarafina understands that she alone will bear the guilt for this ruin. He frames her surrender as an act of bravery. We see this constantly in high-control cases. The abuser makes the victim responsible for the very violence the abuser is about to commit. The negotiation enters its terminal phase. Adrian promises an end to the extreme monitoring, offering an illusion of freedom. When she explicitly states her distrust, he smoothly pivots back to the credible threat against Duval. He references his specialized legal team, a mechanism built exclusively to dismantle men like her protector. Sarafina begins to exhibit physical symptoms of a panic response, blurred vision, restricted breathing. The clinical reality sets in. She recognizes the absolute certainty in his dead, calm eyes. He will execute this financial and social slaughter without a single drop of mercy. Stripped of all remaining agency, her resistance shatters completely. She softly asks how long the sentence will be. To the chilling parameter of his demand, he requires her to stay until she remembers why she loved him. He has entirely conflated psychological captivity with affection. If the programming fails, he notes, they will simply address that, later a clear indicator he never intends to let her leave. Sarafina looks at the man who weaponized intimacy into a behavioral prison. Realizing he genuinely believes his own distorted reality, she negotiates a meager 24-hour delay. Stepping out into the biting morning air, her nervous system crashes. Severe tremors overtake her extremities. She collapses onto a public bench, hiding her face. A simple life lesson emerges here. Survival often looks exactly like total defeat. Let us examine the intervention phase. Sarafina is paralyzed by the impossible binary choice, her own psychological execution or the destruction of an innocent. Her isolation is punctured by a call from Catherine Mercer. Upon hearing of the meeting, Catherine delivers a sharp, objective assessment. Negotiating directly with a highly malignant narcissist is a catastrophic error because they only gather ammunition. When Sarafina reveals the extortion attempt, a heavy silence falls over the line. Catherine challenges the trauma bond directly. She refuses to accept the helpless posture of the victim, demanding instead that Sarafina utilize the legal and social weapons they have prepared. The directive is absolute: expose the monster. We are witnessing a critical battle for the autonomy of the subject. The Stockholm Syndrome dictates Sarafina must absorb the punishment to shield Duval. Catherine systematically dismantles this toxic martyrdom. She reminds Sarafina that Duval is a capable adult who willingly engaged the threat. To treat him as a helpless dependent is an insult to his agency. Here is a profound truth about human nature. Trusting someone means allowing them to face the consequences of their own brave choices, even when those choices carry immense danger. Catherine strikes a calculated blow at her pride, questioning her strength before presenting the immediate solution. The countersuit is ready. The victim must choose to become the warrior. The cognitive dissonance finally breaks. Rapid emotional flashbacks flood her mind, quiet moments of safety with Duval contrasted with the chilling realization of her own deceit. She acknowledges a harsh reality. Duval owes her absolutely no forgiveness. However, the survival instinct reasserts itself. She owes herself the dignity of a final stand. She issues the authorization. Within 3 hours, the counter-offensive detonates in the public sphere. The case file is suddenly wide open for the world to read. The filings detail the extreme coercive control, the digital stalking, the testimonies from prior victims who survived his psychological experiments. The private laboratory of the megalomaniac is violently exposed to the light. The fallout is immediate and catastrophic for the carefully constructed ecosystem of the abuser. Corporate boards despise scandal, and the media senses blood in the water. Catherine provides the clinical updates, but the focus of our subject remains stubbornly fixated on Duval. She asks if he has reacted, desperate to measure his hatred. Catherine delivers an agonizingly precise psychological assessment. Duval does not hate her, but rather hates his enduring attachment to her. It is a devastating blow, proving that trauma damages everyone in its blast radius. Meanwhile, the narcissist refuses to accept a defensive posture. By 6 p.m, Adrian orchestrates his countermeasure, staging a highly controlled press event. You and I must pay close attention to this final display of narcissistic injury. Adrian stands before the cameras, hands perfectly simulating the posture of a wounded, benevolent protector. He frames his severe pathology as deep, abiding care for a troubled woman. When confronted with the sheer volume of his victims, he deploys the classic denial mechanism of the highly manipulative personality. He refuses to validate their reality, instead offering a hollow apology that places the burden of discomfort entirely on their misinterpretation of his friendship. It is a chilling masterclass in public deception. He remains entirely disconnected from the devastation he causes, locked forever in the sterile prison of his own absolute perfection. Let us open the case file on Serafina Voss together, shall we? We are going to unpack the pathology of a public execution. We see Adrian, the classic megalomaniacal narcissist, standing at the podium. He denies the surveillance allegations with chilling, sociopathic perfection. The subject, Serafina, watches the broadcast, experiencing a severe physiological drop, classic autonomic nervous system distress. Then, her phone rings. It is Kyle. She answers with trembling hands. His voice is a flat, cold instrument. He demands to know why she filed a countersuit without his consultation. You see, she has dragged a public war into their private trauma. In the clinical framework of coercive control, the victim often believes they must shield their new protector. Serafina insists she is trying to protect Kyle, her eyes burning with exhaustion. But Kyle rejects the savior dynamic. He clinically outlines the reality of the incoming legal assault. Adrian's defense team will weaponize her psychological profile. They will label her unstable. They will paint her as a vindictive, damaged woman who seduced a powerful, lonely man to orchestrate his ruin. Whether the allegations are true or false is irrelevant in the court of public in. It is a textbook smear campaign designed to invert the victim and the abuser. Observe the hallmark of megalomaniacal narcissism, classic psychological manipulation that leaves the target breathless and cornered. Sarafina begs to know what alternative she had. She admits she actually offered to return to Adrian, presenting herself as a sacrifice to neutralize the threat. This is a profound manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. The hostage willingly returns to the cage. Kyle's voice drops to a dangerous cadence. He reveals he already knows about her offer. He explicitly rejects her martyrdom. He tells her he does not know what he wants anymore. Her vision blurs with tears of frantic apologies. He orders her to stop apologizing and start thinking. We must analyze the architecture of Adrian's narrative. He is systematically casting Sarafina as the villain and Kyle as the easily manipulated fool. Kyle demands tactical unity. They must operate together, or not at all. He is exhausted by fighting blind in a psychological war zone. He lays down an absolute boundary, no more omissions, no more carefully curated partial truths. Complete truth is required. Sarafina closes her eyes, yielding to the interrogation. Then, Kyle asks the foundational question of any trauma bond. Did she love Adrian? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. She desperately wants to Siddhartha's her history, but she has promised him the raw truth. She says yes. She confesses that the affection existed only before the psychological rot set in. She clarifies that Marcus Chen was merely a flight response, a desperate escape rather than a genuine attachment. When Kyle asks about his own role in her psyche, she falters. She admits she simply has not had the mental bandwidth to process it. Kyle processes this data coldly. He acknowledges that Adrian's press conference was a masterclass in mass manipulation. Public sympathy has shifted. The only viable countermeasure, he explains, is radical transparency. She must publicly disclose every ugly detail, including her infidelity. She panics. Realizing this will obliterate her remaining credibility. The exposure therapy is scheduled for the following afternoon, a press conference where she, Kyle, and their legal counsel, Catherine, will display their psychological scars to the world. Sarafina doubts her own fortitude, but Kyle diagnoses the alternative with brutal clarity. If she retreats, Adrian retains permanent ownership of her reality. The call ends, leaving her in a dim, sterile room to confront her own fractured ego. Can she stand before a firing squad of cameras and confess every ugly truth? By 1:45 the next day, the stage is set. Catherine has secured a neutral hotel environment. Sarafina arrives, wearing the armor of a simple professional suit. Catherine intercepts her in the corridor, inquiring about her mental readiness. Sarafina admits she is terrified. Catherine notes that fear is the only rational response to radical honesty. They breach the conference room. Kyle is already positioned by the window, encased in a dark suit that projects an aura of absolute predatory control. When she enters, their eyes lock in a silent assessment of mutual damage. He closes the distance between them. The clinical exhaustion is stark in his pale eyes. He offers her a final exit strategy, quietly stating she does not have to endure this public vivisection. But she refuses the out. She acknowledges the pain, yet chooses the fire anyway. A fleeting expression flickers across Kyle's face. It is not quite absolution, but perhaps the foundational stage of genuine empathy. The double doors swing wide, admitting a flood of journalists and blinding camera flashes. Catherine assumes the podium first, establishing the parameters of this psychological theater. She explicitly states this is not a legal tribunal, but an unfiltered testimony from three individuals caught in a toxic web of manipulation. She yields the floor. Kyle takes the podium, his posture demanding immediate submission from the room. He displays zero autonomic arousal. He is a man who forged an empire through sheer will. He calmly introduces himself. Kyle delivers a precise, emotionless recounting of the catalyst. 3 weeks prior, he identified a threat against his employee, a systematic stalking campaign. He details his defensive maneuvers. He investigated the megalomaniacal narcissist, confronted him, and exposed the pathology to Adrian's inner circle. His vocal cadence remains flawlessly even. He states he does not regret neutralizing the threat, but he admits a critical error in his threat assessment. He acted without full comprehension of the relational dynamics at play. Having delivered his clinical summary, he steps away. Sarafina approaches the microphone. Her limbs tremble, every lens locks onto her fragile state. She anchors her shaking hands to the wood, stabilizing herself in reality. She introduces herself and initiates the confession. She dissects the timeline of 2 years with Adrian. She outlines the classic symptoms of coercive control, the digital surveillance, the systematic isolation from her support network, the deliberate erosion of her reality testing. But then, she introduces the variable that shatters the perfect victim archetype. She confesses her own deception. She admits to infidelity and the subsequent manipulation required to conceal it. A wave of cognitive dissonance sweeps through the reporters. She acknowledges that Adrian's paranoia was initially fed by her own lies. We observe a rare phenomenon here, mutual psychological destruction. She articulates that while Adrian was a master of manipulation, she was an active participant in the toxicity. She clarifies her boundaries. Adrian's subsequent escalation into obsessive surveillance remains a severe criminal pathology entirely unjustified by her actions. However, she refuses the comfort of the martyr complex. She publicly dismantles the myth of the flawless victim, admitting her errors caused collateral damage. She directs her gaze entirely to Kyle, offering a raw apology for dragging him into a psychological war zone. As she steps back, the room detonates into chaotic, predatory questioning. Catherine immediately neutralizes the interrogation, shutting down all questions. Kyle executes a swift extraction, guiding Sarafina through a secondary exit before the media swarm can converge. They retreat to a secure, elevated environment, a hotel suite 3 floors up. Catherine paces the floor, monitoring the digital fallout. The radical honesty strategy is disrupting the narrative, though Adrian's apparatus is predictably framing it as further manipulation. Kyle softly dismisses Catherine from the room. The silence between the two survivors is heavy with adrenaline. Kyle moves to the glass, observing the city. He diagnoses her performance as either profound courage or stupidity. Let us conclude with a critical life lesson. Healing only begins when the deception ends. She acknowledges the dual diagnosis of courage and stupidity. She asks for the next phase of the protocol. Kyle explains the holding pattern. They must measure the public's capacity to digest the truth. If the narcissist retains control, Kyle vows they will engage in open warfare. She questions his irrational commitment, suggesting he protect his empire. He steps into her personal space. He states he sees a woman actively rewiring her trauma to become honest. It is a grueling process. She whispers she is unworthy of absolution, but he grants it regardless. Before she can process this, his phone rings. Let us open the clinical file and examine the exact moment the psychological baseline shatters. The subject, Kyle, glances at his screen. Watch his physiological response as he answers his security director. His facial capillaries constrict, draining all color. The questions are purely tactical. When? How bad? Lock it down. I am on my way. He terminates the call. Beside him, Sarafina experiences a textbook sympathetic nervous system drop. What happened? She asks. Kyle's pale eyes mirror a sociopathic freeze response. Someone just firebombed his flagship restaurant. Casualties and fire are confirmed. He leaves the sentence unfinished because the diagnosis is clear. The megalomaniac narcissist, Adrian, just escalated from litigation to physical violence. 23 minutes later, they arrive at the barricades. Toxic smoke billows from the shattered glass of the second floor, a space where Kyle once maintained absolute environmental control. Sarafina stands anchored beside him, observing flames consume 15 years of his identity. Clinically speaking, Kyle exhibits profound dissociation. His face is completely void of affect. His pale eyes reflect the thermal radiation, while his brain calculates the precise tactical deficits. A fire chief approaches them, visibly fatigued. Mr. Duval, I am sorry, the chief says, noting the chemical accelerant acted with abnormal speed. Kyle requests the casualty report with zero vocal inflection. 2 servers and a cook sustained secondary burns and are hospitalized. The suspect is a lone male, late 30s. The suspect exited exactly 60 seconds prior to combustion. You and I must note how Kyle's jaw tightens, a micro-expression revealing suppressed hostility. The arsonist wore a dark coat and obscured his face, operating with the precision of a paid contractor. Whoever executed this possessed high operational intelligence. Kyle dismisses the chief with a single cold look. Sarafina observes this withdrawal, her own trauma bond securing her to his side. She identifies Adrian as the perpetrator, predicting his continued escalation. Kyle simply tells her they must leave the perimeter. They return to the vehicle in total silence. His grip on the steering wheel demonstrates immense physical restraint, his respiration deliberately and artificially paced. He is far from stable. We are witnessing a man barely containing a catastrophic psychological fracture. To avoid predictable patterns, he bypasses their primary residence and drives straight to the Connecticut property, a designated safe zone where they previously isolated themselves from the escalating threat. Arrival occurs after midnight. Kyle cuts the engine, but remains paralyzed in the driver's seat, staring into the absolute darkness of the structure. Sarafina breaks the silence, manifesting classic misplaced guilt. 3 people got hurt because of me, she whispers. Kyle immediately redirects her cognitive distortion. He points out that Adrian chose violence as a pathological response to losing dominance. It is not the same thing, he insists, his exhausted eyes finally meeting hers in the dark. Kyle firmly dismantling her guilt is crucial here. You did not ignite that chemical fire, he states, pulling her back to objective reality. You did not hire a proxy to commit felony arson. The megalomaniac, Adrian, executed this strike, and he will face total systemic destruction. When Sarafina questions his methodology, Kyle refuses to outline his tactical response. He simply abandons the vehicle and enters the residence. Once inside, he self-medicates, pouring 4 fingers of brown liquor. He assumes a rigid posture by the counter, consuming the depressant in total silence. Sarafina hovers in the doorway, paralyzed by her own helplessness. When he finally instructs her to sleep, she admits her inability to do so. He demands isolation to formulate his counterattack, his vocal exhaustion devastating her. At a certain point, neurological exhaustion forces Sarafina into a fragmented sleep. She regains consciousness, to the grey light of early morning and the distinct scent of brewed coffee. She discovers Kyle locked in the exact geographical position as the prior night. He has not changed his garments. It appears his motor functions have been suspended for 8 hours. When she questions his rest, he flatly denies it. He states he has been analyzing the memory of his deceased sister. This introduces a radical shift in his behavioral profile. Historically, he has kept this familial trauma entirely suppressed. Sarafina cautiously prompts him for data. He stares into his mug, his vocal tone entirely hollow. Her name was Elena, 2 years his junior. He describes her with positive traits he failed to validate while she lived. Let us examine the architecture of his childhood trauma. Our father was a man who weaponized affection, Kyle explains, detailing a classic narcissistic abuse-free cycle. The patriarch claimed to offer protection while dismantling their psychological stability. Kyle asks Sarafina if this methodology sounds familiar, linking his father's pathology to Adrian. By age 17, Elena exhibited severe depressive symptoms, cessation of caloric intake, insomnia, total personality erosion. Kyle admits he was too consumed by his own survival instincts to register her deterioration. He places his cup down with mechanical precision. She died shortly after turning 19 from an overdose. The coroner ruled it accidental, but Kyle knew the truth. Her final written statement was simply that she was tired of being afraid. Sarafina exhibits an immediate, empathic response, offering condolences, which Kyle clinically deflects. He states the 20 years since the event have provided sufficient time for intellectual processing. However, you and I can see the unresolved pathological guilt. He confesses his core trauma. He escaped the toxic environment and left his vulnerable sibling behind. He utilized a common cognitive distortion, convincing himself she possessed the resilience to survive their abuser alone. When Sarafina attempts to rationalize his actions by citing his youth, he rejects the defense. He asserts he possessed the cognitive maturity to understand that abandoning her equated to a death sentence. His pale eyes suddenly sharpen, directing the hostility outward. He draws a devastating parallel to his recent treatment of Sarafina. Kyle equates his childhood flight response to his recent rejection of Sarafina. I prioritized my own survival over your protection, he states, diagnosing his own behavioral pattern. I expelled you from my territory rather than validating your trauma. The clinical comparison strikes Sarafina with physical force. She immediately rejects the correlation, pointing out that she and his sister both utilized deception. They were both attempting to survive environments devoid of autonomous control. Yet Kyle remains fixated on his perceived failure, arguing he abandoned them at their most vulnerable threshold. Sarafina closes the physical distance, though she stops just short of tactile contact. She forces him to confront agency. Your sister made a fatal, tragic choice, she explains quietly, but you did not make it for her. She applies this same logic to their current crisis. Adrian, making the autonomous decision to incinerate your property is not my psychological burden, she insists. We cannot regulate the destructive impulses of desperate, fragmented individuals. Kyle grips the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white as he processes this boundary. Then, what parameters can we actually control? He demands. Sarafina delivers a fundamental lesson in psychological resilience. We can only control our response, she tells him, and whether we allow their shattered minds to break our own. A prolonged silence dominates the room. When Kyle finally speaks, his vocal tone is chillingly regulated. I am going to destroy him. He states his intention to systematically dismantle Adrian Mercer, his financial holdings, his social status, and his freedom. If you look closely at this moment, you witness the complete death of Kyle's restraint. Sarafina experiences a visceral drop in her core temperature. She warns him that a direct counterattack will be perceived as malicious retaliation by the authorities. Kyle's response is devoid of self-preservation. He explicitly abandons optical management. Adrian incinerated his territory and harmed his dependents, violating a permanent boundary. Kyle's pale eyes display a lethal clarity. He admits he has been functioning in a defensive, regulated capacity, but that protocol is now terminated. He initiates a call to his operative. He demands every raw data file on Adrian Mercer financial irregularities, digital communications, all surveillance gathered over 21 days. He verbally accepts all legal liabilities. The hunt has begun. He terminates the connection and issues a direct command to Sarafina. He instructs her to evacuate to the city and seek refuge with Catherine, attempting to insulate her from the impending moral decay. "I am about to execute a deeply unethical strategy," he warns, projecting his own fear of corruption onto her. Sarafina anchors herself. She refuses the evacuation order. She highlights his glaring cognitive dissonance. He just spent 10 minutes agonizing over abandoning people, yet demands she abandon him. When he claims this is not her conflict, she vehemently corrects him. She points out that the megalomaniac targeted the restaurant directly because of her legal resistance. She stood at the press conference and shattered the false narrative. She refuses to be shielded from the chaos she actively helped to manifest. Kyle studies her face, and we see the psychological resistance begin to crumble. He issues a final, clinical warning regarding his own pathology. "If you remain, you will witness my absolute baseline," he tells her. "You will see the mechanisms that are neither safe nor regulated." Sarafina declares she is not intimidated by his darkness. "Perhaps you should be," he counters. Sarafina responds with the ultimate exhaustion of a prolonged trauma victim. "I have existed in a state of hypervigilance my entire life, and I am finished running." Kyle processes this declaration, then nods once, accepting their mutual dissent. What follows is a 48-hour period of surgical, unrelenting destruction. Investigators compile irrefutable evidence of illegal leverage, proxy hiring for arson, and catastrophic federal securities violations. The federal net closes with mathematical precision. Catherine coordinates with prosecutors to finalize charges of fraud and arson. By the third day, agents infiltrate Adrian's headquarters. Through the monitor in Connecticut, you and I watch the narcissistic structure completely implode. Adrian is escorted out in restraints, his physical presentation severely degraded, his facial effect totally blank. The apex predator is reduced to a powerless human. Yet Sarafina registers zero dopamine release, only an overwhelming psychological fatigue. Kyle observes the exact same fate. The legal extraction is complete, he confirms. Adrian is in custody, his empire shattered. When Sarafina questions his lack of triumph, Kyle diagnoses his own tragedy. "I just spent 3 weeks becoming the exact ruthless monster I swore I would never replicate." We must examine the psychological toll of retaliation. Sarafina looks at Kyle, the man who stood as her shield, and asks a haunting question. Did he enjoy the destruction they caused? Kyle looks back, his silence betraying a dark honesty. They watch the television screen as Adrian is escorted in handcuffs. In my years of analyzing these files, I rarely see triumph in this phase. This is not victory. This is mere survival, and the casualties are their own moral boundaries. 7 days pass. Catherine calls with a plea deal. Adrian will accept 5 to 7 years for his financial crimes and arson, dropping his retaliatory lawsuits. Sarafina sits on the edge of the guest bed, absorbing the cold reality of justice. Survival often means accepting a fractured peace. You and I must dissect the distinction between legal resolutions and psychological closure. Sarafina asks about the stalking charges. Catherine explains the permanent restraining order is included. A trial would bleed them of millions and drag on for years. The attorney poses a profound question, one I ask all survivors of severe psychological manipulation. Do you want justice, revenge, or closure? Justice requires a courtroom. Revenge demands the abuser suffers. Closure is the quiet act of walking away. The lesson here is absolute. You cannot heal while holding on to the blade that cut you. Sarafina pictures Adrian in federal lockup.
The man who orchestrated a masterclass
In coercive control. The arsonist who still, in his diseased mind, plays the eternal victim. Sarafina whispers her deepest desire. She wants the narcissist to feel genuine remorse. It is a common symptom of a lingering trauma bond. We want the monster to grow a conscience. But Catherine delivers the clinical truth. A courtroom cannot mandate empathy. Whether Adrian ever comprehends the gravity of his pathology is entirely his burden, not hers. The moment she accepts this, the psychological weight fractures. She authorizes the plea deal. Sitting alone in that quiet guest room, the nervous system begins to downregulate. True peace starts when we stop demanding apologies from those incapable of giving them. She walks into the kitchen and finds Kyle preparing a meal. Real food. Grounded, human care replacing the frantic efficiency of survival mode. Let us observe the dynamic between victim and protector. She tells Kyle the deal is done. He continues chopping garlic, his hands steady, anchoring the room. He asks if she is at peace with the outcome, reminding her that this choice belongs solely to her. This is critical for her autonomy. She points out that Kyle spent 3 agonizing weeks dismantling Adrian's life to protect her, not to satisfy a personal bloodlust. Kyle's pale eyes lock onto hers, devoid of the toxic control she is used to. He states that her satisfaction is his only metric for success. She leans against the counter, admitting she is simply exhausted from the war. Healing is rarely a triumphant shout. More often, it is just the quiet sigh of a soldier laying down their heavy armor. What happens when the threat is finally removed? The patient must figure out what normal looks like. Kyle admits he has no idea, but he is willing to learn if she is. They sit at the kitchen table, mimicking the behaviors of regular people. The conversation remains entirely on the surface. They discuss the restaurant, her academic thesis, the weather. It is a fragile comfort, built on the edge of a massive psychological crater. We see this often in post-traumatic recovery. The nervous system rejects sudden intimacy. Later, they move to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the sofa with a very calculated distance between them. Sarafina breaks the silence, asking the question that has haunted her. Why did he step in when she was breaking down? Kyle swirls the wine in his glass, his baseline calm, never wavering. He tells her she reminded him of Elena, not in physical appearance, but in the specific tragic way she navigated physical space. The way a victim of chronic emotional abuse makes themselves small to avoid detection. It caught his attention, but the clinical attachment formed later. You and I must recognize the shift here. He realized she was not looking for a savior to rescue her. She was looking for an equal to stand beside her while she clawed her own way out of the darkness. Sarafina denies her own agency, crediting his resources, but he corrects the cognitive distortion instantly. Resources are useless without a spine. True strength is pulling yourself from the wreckage even if someone holds a light. Kyle proposes a radical, healthy paradigm. They will decipher their connection slowly, without the crushing weight of expectations. If they never figure it out, they remain friends. Most importantly, any choice they make moving forward will stem from cognitive clarity, not the panic of a trauma bond. The sheer simplicity of this boundary nearly brings her to tears. Real love does not demand immediate certainty. 3 months evaporate from the timeline. Safina secures a small, affordable apartment in Brooklyn, a space that is entirely hers. Untainted by Adrian's megalomania, she resumes her graduate thesis, analyzing the very coercive control she survived. Meanwhile, Kyle reconstructs his restaurant from the ashes, reinforcing the physical and psychological foundations. Their routine stabilizes into predictable patterns. Coffee on Wednesdays, dinner on Sundays. It is a clinical gray area, neither fully romantic nor strictly platonic. But on a bitter Tuesday in February, the past violently breaches containment. An envelope arrives on prison stationery, bearing the unmistakable handwriting of her abuser. Her physiological response is immediate. Hands trembling, cortisol spiking. Inside is a single page from Cell Block C. Adrian writes that he is surrounded by violent men he once considered beneath him, but the isolation has pierced his grandiosity. The prison psychiatrist has formally diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder. A textbook megalomaniac forced to look into the mirror, the ultimate collapse of the false self. Look at the pathology bleeding through the ink. Adrian admits his catastrophic cognitive failure. He could not distinguish between Ziltra's protecting a partner and systematically controlling a hostage. He confesses to intentional, methodical destruction under the guise of care. He claims he expects no forgiveness, stating he finally grasps her inherent right to autonomy. He acknowledges that she was an independent human being, not property to be managed. He apologizes for the devastation. Safina reads the confession 3 separate times. As a behavioral analyst, I always warn against the temporary lucidity of the incarcerated narcissist. The words sound perfect, but true change is measured in decades, not a few months of mandated therapy. The apology is just a data point. She folds the heavy paper and seals it in a drawer. There will be no response. This is a massive psychological victory. She realizes that his sudden self-awareness does not rewrite history or stitch her wounds back together. It is simply new data, and she alone dictates how to process it. That Sunday, she places the letter on the table between herself and Kyle. He absorbs the words and asks for her clinical assessment of her own feelings. She is torn between believing his remorse and suspecting a highly evolved manipulation. Kyle delivers a profound behavioral truth. Both realities can exist simultaneously. An abuser can feel genuine, agonizing regret while remaining entirely capable of repeating the same destruction. The capacity for guilt does not equal the capacity for change. Safina absorbs this duality. She asks the question every victim asks about their captor: will he actually change? Kyle answers without malice. He assumes Adrian will try, but his success or failure is completely irrelevant to her life. You and I must remember this fundamental rule of recovery. You are never responsible for monitoring the rehabilitation of the person who broke you. Your only duty is to your own future. Outside, the winter snow falls quietly. Safina shifts the focus from the ghost in the prison to the man sitting right in front of her. She tells Kyle she is finally ready to define what exists between them. Kyle freezes, his guarded exterior bracing for impact. He asks what shifted in her psychological landscape to make her ready for this significant step. Sarafina looks at the man who shielded her, the man who became her anchor. She delivers a statement of absolute, hard-won autonomy. She realizes she no longer needs him for survival. And because the desperation is gone, choosing him becomes a genuine act of free will, untainted by the lingering shadows of Stockholm Syndrome. Kyle's stoic mask cracks, revealing a dangerous mixture of fear and hope. He asks if she's making that choice. She reaches out, her fingers wrapping around his. A quiet, definitive yes. Spring thaws the city. She defends her thesis on coercive control, turning her trauma into academic armor. They do not rush to move in together. They reject forced labels. True freedom is building a life piece by piece, ensuring the foundation is finally made of solid stone. We observe a critical time jump. Sarafina and Kyle are building a stable baseline, constructing genuine trust. The trauma loop appears broken. Then, during a walk in Central Park, the stimulus returns. Her phone rings. Catherine, the megalomaniac narcissist, is being released early. Parole in 3 months. Sarafina's steps falter. Kyle notices instantly. What's wrong? She relays the data. His expression hardens into a predatory mask. Do you want me to? She cuts off his violent ideation. No, I don't want you to do anything. He served his time. The restraining order is active. Kyle challenges her logic. What if he contacts you? Her response marks a massive psychological breakthrough. Then I report it, and he goes back to prison. This is the moment she stops acting like prey. 3 months of intensive trauma processing rewires a survivor's brain. She looks up at Kyle, a man who by all clinical metrics should terrify her, and feels a profound absence of fear. I want you and I to really examine this shift together. Kyle, a man accustomed to absolute control, studies her face and recognizes her hard-won autonomy. He tells her he is proud, noting that she no longer shrinks herself or begs him to neutralize her threats. She credits him for her survival, her eyes burning with emotion, but he immediately redirects that power back to her. He insists she would have healed regardless, just on a longer timeline. The lesson here is deeply human. True recovery isn't about finding a protector to save you from the dark. It is about building the foundation to finally save yourself. Consider the psychological weight of this exchange. This man dismantled a criminal empire for her, yet managed to care without suffocating control. When she says she loves him, he freezes, insisting she owes him nothing. But Sarafina reveals a massive behavioral breakthrough. I finally understands the vast difference between loving someone and merely needing them for survival. It is the absolute antithesis of a trauma bond. He pulls her close for a slow, deliberate kiss, rooted entirely in mutual choice rather than desperate gratitude. Fast forward, exactly 1 year. It is nearing midnight, and Sarafina stands peacefully in the quiet kitchen of his penthouse. The underlying truth is universal. Love born from conscious choice will always outlast affection born from raw necessity. She isn't scrubbing floors in hypervigilance or hiding in terror. She is simply making tea. The sensory details are identical: the sharp scent of lemon cleaner, the cold gleam of marble, the sprawling city 42 floors below. Yet her internal psychological landscape has shifted entirely. Kyle walks in, drained from paperwork, and anchors himself by wrapping an arm around her waist. She admits she couldn't sleep, seeking comfort in his quiet company. He kisses her head, a gesture of profound domestic safety. They stand together in the exact room where her trauma originally peaked, where a terrified victim once stood alone, swallowing her tears. The life lesson here is striking. The greatest measure of human resilience isn't always escaping a dark environment, but finally learning to feel completely safe in the very room that used to terrify you. This is the spot where a dangerous man once asked a question that derailed their lives. "No more ghosts in this house," Kyle whispers. By agreeing, Sarafina actively banishes the psychological phantoms of her past. Outside, Manhattan stretches out millions of human beings, navigating their own beautiful and broken cycles. Let's look closely at the reality inside this amber-lit kitchen. These are two individuals who survived their own self-destruction. Clinically speaking, they know trauma doesn't magically evaporate just because you identify it. The psychological scars remain. But they face the unknown future equipped with a newly forged cognitive tool, conscious agency, real choice. The ultimate truth of recovery is that you cannot erase a painful history, but you can absolutely choose the person who stands beside you in the peaceful aftermath. It is the rare behavioral freedom that exists when the pretense of safety becomes actual security. Sarafina leaves her cup in the sink as Kyle gently leads her away. Meanwhile, in a maximum security cell, the megalomaniac, narcissist Adrian Mercer stares at a concrete ceiling. His disordered brain still short-circuits trying to comprehend how genuine connection can exist without manipulative control. But his pathology is no longer our concern. This psychological triumph belongs entirely to Sarafina. She achieved the ultimate therapeutic goal. She chose herself first, then consciously chose a partner who mirrored that respect. She didn't seek a savior to rescue her. The most vital lesson in human relationships is that we don't need someone to fix our flaws. We simply need someone who looks at our honest, broken pieces and decides they want to stay. One of the most important educational lessons from Sarafina's story is that abuse does not always leave visible bruises. Adrian Mercer never needs to physically hurt Sarafina in order to control her. Instead, he uses surveillance, manipulation, emotional pressure, and fear. He tracks her, monitors her communication, sends messages from unknown numbers, appears near her workplace, and uses flowers as a reminder of past control. To outsiders, he may look charming, successful, generous, and respectable. He gives talks about ethical leadership and presents himself as a caring man. But behind that polished image is a pattern of coercive control. This teaches viewers that abuse can exist even when there is no physical violence. A person can be trapped by fear, guilt, confusion, and constant monitoring. Sarah keeps telling herself that because Adrian never hit her, maybe it was not abuse. That belief is one of the most dangerous traps in the story. Many victims minimize their own pain because society often teaches them to recognize only obvious violence. The story encourages a deeper understanding. If someone controls your movements, isolates you, makes you no doubt your memory, follows you after you leave, or uses fear and use to keep power over you, that is harmful. Education should teach people to identify emotional and psychological abuse groups early before it becomes normalized. Sarafina's haunted behavior in Kayla's kitchen shows how trauma lives in the body. She flinches at doors, scrubs clean surfaces, and calculates escape routes because her nervous system has learned to expect danger. The lesson is clear and meaningful. Pain does not need to be visible to be valid. People should listen when someone says they feel unsafe, and victims should learn that they do not need bruises to deserve help, protection, and freedom.